Hey there, sleepyheads! Tonight's tale is a little damp, a little earthy, and just the tiniest bit barnyard. We're leaning in close, but not too close, to one of the least glamorous truths of medieval life. Why nobody, rich or poor, smelled particularly fresh. No scented body wash, no quick shower before work, not even the reassuring sting of store-bought deodorant. Just the musk of unwashed wool, the tang of wood smoke in hair, and the ever-present hint of animals, mud, and whatever the wind happened to carry through the streets. You might wrinkle your nose now, and trust me, sometimes they did too, but most of the time they simply lived with it. Because in the Middle Ages, smell wasn't just background noise. It was the air you breathed, the clothes you wore, the streets you walked. It was part of life's texture, woven into every market day, every hearth fire, every muddy walk home from the fields. Before we wander into those narrow alleys and crowded halls, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy these slow, soft wanderings into the stranger, smellier corners of the past. If you're new here, welcome to this quiet little nook of history where we whisper about the forgotten, the unromantic, and the oddly human details of how people really lived and smelled. And if your eyes are already heavy, that's fine. You can always come back tomorrow. The past isn't going anywhere. It's still scrubbing a tunic in the river, sprinkling herbs in bedclothes, and hoping the wind blows the other way. Now, before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Which country? What time of night? And what's the weather outside your window? Are you bundled in a blanket while rain taps the glass? Or stretched out in the dark, letting the summer night air drift in? I want to know what your evening feels like. If you haven't already, grab a cosy drink or your favourite sleepy snack, though maybe skip the garlic bread for this one. All right, let the room grow quiet. Let the hush settle over you like a wool cloak at dusk. Take a slow breath in and out. Now, let's step back to a time when fresh meant something very, very different. Before the days of glossy shampoo bottles and cheerful soap jingles, medieval hygiene was shaped by a very different set of priorities. Ones rooted in availability, necessity, and cultural norms, rather than the promise of smelling like lavender meadows or ocean breezes. Understanding life before soap ads means setting aside the modern idea that cleanliness is a consumer-driven performance and looking at how people in the Middle Ages approached it through the lens of survival, religion, and practicality. In a pre-industrial society, cleanliness wasn't tied to brand loyalty or fragrance marketing. Soap did exist in some form, often made locally from animal fats and lye, but it was harsh, expensive, and not necessarily used for daily body washing. The medieval concept of clean was as much about appearing socially respectable as it was about removing dirt. Cleanliness could mean changing into a fresh shift undergarment, combing one's hair, or washing hands and face before a meal. Bathing the whole body was less frequent, but that didn't mean people ignored hygiene altogether. It was just understood and practiced differently than today. Christian doctrine, local tradition, and even monastic rules influenced washing habits. Many religious orders included guidelines for washing hands, feet and face, but discouraged frequent full-body bathing, partly to promote humility and avoid indulgence. In some urban centres, public bathhouses were popular gathering places, offering not just a chance to wash, but also to socialise. Yet these bathhouses could fall in and out of favour depending on moral attitudes or concerns about disease. After the Black Death, for example, many began to suspect public bathing as a potential source of contagion. Bathing was often seasonal, especially for peasants. In summer, washing in rivers or ponds was more feasible, while in winter, cold temperatures and limited heated water made full immersion less appealing. People might instead rely on partial washing, hands, face and feet, combined with changing linen underclothes to absorb sweat and keep outer garments cleaner. Laundry itself was labour-intensive, requiring water hauling, heating, scrubbing and drying, so it was done less frequently than modern wardrobes would demand. The reality is that in a time when almost everyone was exposed to livestock, wood smoke and unpaved streets smelling fresh was relative. Scents we might now associate with unwashed were simply part of life. The exception could be wealthier individuals who had access to finer linens, more servants for laundry, and perfumed oils or herbs to mask odours. For peasants, fresh herbs tucked into clothing, smoke from the hearth, and the natural scent of wool and leather were the daily aroma. No one expected the floral citrus or clean cotton smells that dominate modern soap aisles. Those associations are a product of industrial perfumery and 20th century advertising campaigns. The Industrial Revolution transformed hygiene from a practical matter into a mass-market commodity. By the late 19th century, advertisements reframed soap as not just useful, but essential for social acceptance and personal worth. This shift made the idea of daily showers and a perfumed body a cultural norm in the modern West. Looking back, medieval people lived by a different standard, one in which hygiene was embedded in community rhythms, shaped by natural resource sources, and free of commercial persuasion. In short, life before soap ads was not necessarily dirtier by choice, but guided by entirely different ideas of what it meant to be clean. And in that context, smelling fresh was less a goal and more a seasonal bonus, if it happened at all. For medieval people, fresh meant something entirely different than the floral soaps, citrus shampoos, and laundry detergents that define the concept today. Without the industrial perfumes and cleaning agents that now shape our expectations, cleanliness and scent were judged in a relative, practical way, rooted in the realities of their world. To feel fresh might simply mean you were free of visible dirt, your hands and face had been washed, and your clothes were changed into a recently laundered linen shift. The absence of sweat from hard labour, even for just a few hours, could count as freshness. If one had the luxury of herbal rinses, scented oils, or smoke-infused garments, it was an added bonus, not a baseline expectation. This difference in perception was shaped by the environment. In towns and villages, the air itself was a mixture of wood smoke, livestock, damp earth, and human presence. In that context, natural body odour was not a glaring flaw, but part of the shared atmosphere. A person who smelled of baked bread, hay, or clean wool might be described as pleasant compared to someone whose clothing carried the sour tang of sweat after threshing grain or tending animals in summer heat. The standards were comparative and often seasonal. In cold months with less sweat and more layers, people could stay fresh for longer simply because conditions kept odours at bay. Freshness was also tied to social and material status. Wealthier households could afford more frequent laundering, access to perfumed waters, and clothing made from finer fabrics that absorbed less odour. The poor often relied on the freshness of newly washed undergarments to create the impression of cleanliness, even if outer garments were rarely laundered. A whiff of rosemary, lavender, or sage sewn into clothing might signal refinement or care, while the scent of tallow soap on the skin could be interpreted as proof of good upkeep. In many cases, fresh meant smelling of something intentional rather than accidental, a sprig of herbs, a dab of rosewater, or a faint trace of beeswax from polished furniture or church candles. Religious and moral ideas also influenced the meaning of freshness. Monks and nuns were encouraged to maintain personal cleanliness as a reflection of discipline, though without vanity or excess. Among lay people, washing before meals or for Sunday Mass was often a point of pride, a moment to present oneself in a way that neighbours would notice. Cleanliness was a social signal, and smelling fresh could be less about appealing to one's own senses and more about showing respectability to others. In this way, fresh in medieval times was not a fixed daily state to be achieved, but a temporary and situational one. It might last only a morning before work in the fields or fade after a long walk through muddy streets. Yet within those brief windows, people took genuine satisfaction in it. A face rinsed with cool water, a change into clean linen, a dusting of crushed herbs. These were small transformations that to them were every bit as uplifting as a hot shower and scented lotion might be to us. If we judge the medieval idea of freshness by modern marketing standards, it seems incomplete, even crude. But in its own context, it made perfect sense. It was attainable, practical, and socially understood. In their world, smelling fresh meant you had, for a moment, stepped out of the grime and labour of everyday life, and that was enough. To a medieval nose, odour was not an intrusion so much as a constant companion, part of the normal sensory landscape. People were accustomed to living in close proximity to animals, open hearths, unpaved streets, and other human beings who bathed infrequently by modern standards. Without our era's array of chemical deodorizers and perfumed products, the baseline of everyday smell was simply higher, and because everyone shared in it, there was little cause for offence. What might make a 21st century visitor wrinkle their nose was often invisible to medieval perception. Part of this acceptance came from familiarity. The human sense of smell adjusts quickly to its environment, and in communities where scents from tallow smoke, manure, salted fish, drying herbs and sweat were ever present, the brain simply filtered them out as background. A shepherd's cloak that smelled of lanolin and wet wool was not unpleasant. It was a marker of honest work. The same was true in towns, where the mingled aromas of a bakehouse, a tannery and a stable were just the scent of daily life. Social expectations reinforced this tolerance. Cleanliness had practical limits, and so long as someone met those, washing hands and face, changing into fresh linen when possible, and avoiding the smell of actual rot or decay, they were not considered unkempt. Sweat was linked to labour and therefore not inherently shameful. In fact, the smell of a body that had worked in the fields could be interpreted as proof of diligence, while certain pleasant smells, such as rosewater or costly imported spices, were more about displaying wealth than masking odour completely. Religious and moral attitudes also played a role. The Church often emphasised moderation and humility, which discouraged excessive attention to physical appearance or scent. Elaborate perfumes could be frowned upon as vanity, while natural body odour was seen as an unavoidable part of the human condition. In some religious texts, the scents of certain professions, like incense from a church worker's clothing or the resin from a carpenter's hands, were even framed as honourable, tied to the work of one's calling. The acceptance of odour also had a practical side. Medieval people knew that eliminating smells was nearly impossible in their environment. Smoke from fires lingered in hair and clothing. Animal byproducts were unavoidable in tanning, candlemaking and cooking, and washing entire outfits was a laborious task that could damage fabric. Instead of striving for scentlessness, people often worked to layer or transform smells, using fragrant herbs, scented oils, or aromatic woods to shift the olfactory balance rather than erase it. This meant that shocking odours were relative. Truly offensive smells, such as those from spoiled food, stagnant water or disease, were alarming precisely because they stood out from the usual background. Such scents were taken as warnings of danger or impurity. Everything else, from the musk of leather boots to the smoky aroma of a wool tunic, was just part of life. In short, medieval noses lived in a world where smell was less a flaw to be eliminated and more a fact to be navigated. Odours carried information, marked identity, and bound people to the work, materials and places that shaped their lives. To them, scent was not the enemy of cleanliness. It was simply the atmosphere in which cleanliness existed. Medieval stench was not just an abstract idea. It was described vividly in the writings of those who lived, travelled, and observed life in the Middle Ages. Chronicles, letters, and travel accounts sometimes recorded smells in as much detail as sights or sounds, particularly when those odours stood out as notable, unpleasant, or symbolic. These first-hand impressions give modern readers a sense of just how pervasive certain scents were and how people interpreted them. Chroniclers often mentioned odours when writing about battles, sieges, and plagues. During the Black Death, for instance, municipal records and monastic accounts described the corrupt air of towns where bodies lay unburied or where mass graves had been opened. In one 14th century Italian chronicle, the stench of the dead was said to cling to the streets for many weeks, affecting not only the living's comfort, but also their belief in the spread of disease through miasma, bad air thought to carry sickness. Similarly, accounts of sieges frequently noted the smell of rotting provisions, waste left uncollected within city walls, and stagnant water fouled by both people and animals. Travellers, especially those on long pilgrimages or diplomatic journeys, often recorded their impressions of urban smells. The 12th century Jewish traveller Benjamin of Tudela, for example, praised the cleanliness of some cities, but also remarked on the overwhelming odours in others, especially in markets where fish, meat and hides were sold without modern preservation. Similarly, Arab traveller Ibn Battuta described the pungent scents of certain European ports, noting the mix of tanneries, open drains and densely packed housing. These were not merely complaints, they reflected the sensory shock of encountering different environmental norms. Letters from the period also provide small personal glimpses of smell. Some were pragmatic, such as correspondence between merchants warning about goods spoiled in transit and emitting a foul odour upon arrival. Others were more domestic in nature, with family letters mentioning the reek of damp clothing in winter or the lingering smell of smoke on someone who had spent the day near a hearth. These details, though casual, show how smell was woven into daily communication when it carried meaning about health, quality, or comfort. Court records and civic ordinances sometimes indirectly referenced stench through complaints or regulations. In London, Paris, and other major cities, records survive of citizens petitioning against neighbours who dumped refuse into streets or waterways, citing the smell as intolerable. Even so, the threshold for what counted as intolerable was much higher than today. Complaints were usually about extreme situations, open cesspits near homes, piles of animal carcasses, or blocked drains, rather than everyday sweat or cooking odours. Monastic writings also provide valuable insight. Monks often commented on the smell of visitors, especially during periods of fasting or pilgrimage, when bathing might be infrequent. Some abbots' letters describe the worldly smells of travellers, sweat, leather, smoke, as contrasting with the more controlled sense of the cloister, which often featured incense, beeswax and clean linen. This distinction reveals how smell could be tied to ideas of purity, devotion or separation from secular life. These first-hand records show that medieval people were not oblivious to odour. They noticed it, described it, and reacted to it when it mattered. But because their baseline tolerance was higher, the smells that drew comment tended to be either unusually strong, connected to danger, or symbolically loaded. Whether in the formal language of chronicles or the casual remarks of a letter, the medieval stench was real, memorable, and occasionally powerful enough to shape how events were recorded for posterity. By the late Middle Ages, an influential and widespread belief held that too much bathing, particularly full-body immersion in hot water, was not just unnecessary but actively dangerous to one's health. This idea was rooted in contemporary medical theory, which combined ancient Greek and Roman thought with medieval interpretations of humoral balance. Physicians believed that the skin's pores acted as gateways to the body's internal balance. When pores were opened by heat and moisture, harmful miasmas, or corrupt air, were thought to seep in, carrying disease. This fear was reinforced during times of epidemic, especially during the Black Death and subsequent plague outbreaks. Medical treatises and civic advice often warned citizens to avoid public bathhouses during such periods, arguing that steam and heat made the body more vulnerable to infection. Some even recommended avoiding bathing altogether, replacing it with dry cleaning methods such as rubbing the skin with linen cloths or dusting with powders and herbs. For people who had grown up hearing these warnings from physicians, priests and elders, avoiding immersion was seen not as neglect, but as prudence. Public bathhouses, which had been relatively common in earlier centuries, began to decline in popularity in many regions, not only due to fears of contagion, but also because they were sometimes associated with immoral behaviour. By the 15th century, moralists and civic leaders in parts of Europe viewed them with suspicion, linking them to disease outbreaks and sin. The combination of moral disapproval and medical caution contributed to a cultural shift in how washing was approached. Instead of full bathing, many people turned to partial cleansing, washing the face, hands and feet, or using scented cloths and perfumes to mask body odour. The pores and disease theory also shaped personal bathing routines among the wealthy. In noble households, hot baths were sometimes reserved for special occasions or illness recovery, rather than daily or even weekly hygiene. When baths were taken, they were often followed by protective measures, rubbing the skin with oils, wearing fresh linen underclothes to keep pores sealed, and avoiding exposure to cold air afterward. Physicians sometimes recommended bathing only in lukewarm water, and even then only after the body had been fortified with food and wine to guard against harmful vapours. This mindset did not mean that medieval people ignored cleanliness altogether. Rather, their definition of clean operated within a different medical and cultural framework. Regular grooming, frequent changes of undergarments, and localized washing of visible areas were seen as sufficient for maintaining health and social respectability. What might appear to modern eyes as an aversion to cleanliness was, in their view, a rational defense against illness. By the time Renaissance-era medical advancements began to challenge older ideas about disease transmission, the suspicion of frequent bathing was deeply ingrained in many European communities. Even as some of urban centres revived bath culture, the legacy of associating immersion with risk lingered. This centuries-long caution around water and pores is one of the reasons why, in the medieval world, smelling fresh was less about being recently washed and more about being perfumed, powdered and dressed in clean linens, protecting not only one's social image, but, in their minds, one's health. In much of medieval Europe, bathing was already an infrequent practice, but the rhythms of the seasons made it even more so. Winter, in particular, was widely considered an impractical and sometimes dangerous time for full-body washing. The reasons were a mix of climate, resources, and prevailing medical beliefs, all of which worked together to make the cold months a long stretch of limited washing. The most obvious factor was temperature. In an era without central heating large quantities of water required significant fuel, usually firewood or charcoal, which was expensive or labour-intensive to gather. Winter was precisely when fuel was most needed for cooking and basic warmth, making it a wasteful luxury to use for filling a bathing tub. Even among wealthier households, fires were often kept small to conserve resources, and heating a bath was an indulgence reserved for special occasions or illness. For the rural poor, who were most of the population, the idea of stripping down in a cold, drafty building to wash was not just unpleasant, it could be life-threatening. The medical theories of the time compounded this avoidance. As with the belief that bathing opened the pores to disease, physicians also warned that cold exposure after bathing could let the chill into the bones and cause fevers or lung ailments. A freshly washed body, warmed and damp from hot water, was seen as especially vulnerable to the cold air that dominated winter months. For this reason, even those who bathed in warmer seasons often reduced or abandoned the practice once the first frost arrived. Instead of immersion, winter hygiene relied on alternatives. People washed their hands and faces with small amounts of warmed water, sometimes mixed with vinegar or herbs. They rubbed the skin with linen cloths to remove surface dirt, changed underclothes more frequently, and used perfumes, pomanders, or scented sachets to mask body odours. In noble households, attendants might wipe the body with cloths dipped in scented water, but even this was partial cleansing rather than a full bath. Seasonal bathing habits were also tied to religious calendars. Feast days, weddings, or major religious festivals might be occasions for a rare winter bath, especially in noble or merchant circles. However, outside of these moments, it was normal to go weeks or even months without full washing. This was not necessarily seen as neglect, it was part of the expected seasonal rhythm. Winter was a time of conserving strength, fuel and health, and bathing simply did not rank as a priority compared to staying warm and fed. By spring, when temperatures rose and fuel demands eased, people might return to fuller washing practices. The thaw also brought greater access to rivers and streams for those without indoor facilities. But during the deep months of winter, the long gap between baths was the norm, shaping the medieval experience of cleanliness into one that was as much about the calendar and the weather as it was about personal preference. Public bathhouses occupied a curious place in daily life, blending practical hygiene with social interaction. In urban centres from Paris to Prague, they were common fixtures by the late Middle Ages, catering to people who lacked private bathing facilities. Bathhouses often offered heated water, steam rooms, and attendants who provided towels, food, or even massages. For many townsfolk, a visit to the bathhouse was not just about getting clean. It was a leisure activity, a chance to meet friends, conduct business, or enjoy a rare moment of comfort. Initially, these establishments enjoyed broad approval, and in some areas, municipal authorities regulated them to maintain water quality and pricing. Bathhouses were sometimes attached to inns or breweries, creating a hybrid space of refreshment and relaxation. The cost was within reach for artisans and merchants, though still a luxury for the rural poor. Hot water, fuel, and infrastructure required significant resources, making bathhouses more practical in densely populated, economically active regions. However, their decline began in the later medieval period for a variety of intertwined reasons. One was the growing association of public bathing with immorality. Shared spaces, thin partitions, and mixed-gender attendance, which was common in certain times and places, sparked suspicion among moral reformers and church authorities. While some bathhouses enforced strict separation of the sexes, others developed reputations as venues for illicit relationships or prostitution. Sermons and moral treatises began to link public bathing with sin, warning that a place meant for cleansing the body might instead corrupt the soul. Another factor was the repeated outbreak of plague and other epidemics in the 14th and 15th centuries. As germ theory did not yet exist, people instead relied on prevailing medical beliefs about miasma and bodily vulnerability. Bathhouses, with their warm, moist environments and contact between strangers, came to be seen as potential sources of contagion. Combined with the existing idea that bathing opened the pores to harmful air, this made them suspect. During times of epidemic, many bathhouses closed temporarily, and some never reopened. Economic shifts also played a role. Maintaining a public bath required reliable water sources, heating fuel, and skilled staff, all of which became more expensive during periods of scarcity or political instability. As towns expanded, water supplies were increasingly diverted to other uses, and municipal budgets often favoured fortifications, markets, or religious buildings over public bathing facilities. By the early modern period, the culture of public bathing in much of northern and western Europe had largely faded. While private bathing persisted in some elite households, and public baths remained in certain parts of southern Europe and the Islamic world, the once common bathhouse had been recast in popular imagination, from a symbol of refinement to a reminder of moral danger and physical risk. The decline of these institutions marked a turning point in European hygiene habits, contributing to the long-standing cultural patterns in which infrequent bathing became not just a necessity, but an accepted social norm. Bathing habits were shaped not only by prevailing medical and cultural beliefs, but also by wealth and social position. The contrast between the routines of the rich and the poor was marked, influencing both frequency and manner of bathing. After the decline of public bathhouses, these differences became even more pronounced. For the upper classes, bathing was often a private and controlled experience. Wealthy nobles and prosperous merchants could afford to heat water in their own homes, either in wooden tubs lined with cloth or, in rare cases, in purpose-built bathing chambers. Large estates sometimes had a designated bathroom, with stone basins and water channeled from nearby springs. Aromatic herbs such as rosemary, lavender, and chamomile were added to the water to mask any lingering odours and to align with the humoral medical theory that certain scents could rebalance the body. Servants prepared and disposed of the water, making the process convenient and reinforcing its status as a luxury. For the elite, bathing might be scheduled before feasts, religious festivals, or diplomatic events as a sign of refinement. In contrast, the poor had neither the facilities nor the fuel to heat large quantities of water. A peasant's bath often meant a quick wash in a basin using cold water from a well, rill, river or rain barrel. Full immersions were rare, reserved for summer months when washing in outdoor streams or ponds was more tolerable. In winter, most relied on partial washing, hands, face and occasionally feet done indoors to avoid the chill. Soap, often made from animal fat and lye, was expensive and harsh. Many rural households substituted sand, ash, or herbal infusions to scrub the skin. For the poor, bathing was not a leisure activity but a practical necessity performed infrequently to conserve resources. These differences extended beyond frequency to the very meaning of cleanliness. Among the wealthy, a fragrant body was a sign of sophistication, enhanced by perfumes imported from the Mediterranean or the Middle East. Among the working poor, the smell of labour, smoke from the hearth, the tang of sweat from the fields, was not only accepted but unavoidable. Bathing could temporarily mask it. but daily life quickly restored the sense of one's occupation. The poor might clean up for church, weddings, or other community gatherings, but no one expected them to maintain the polished appearance of a courtier. Travellers' accounts from the late Middle Ages sometimes remarked on these distinctions. Foreign envoys noted the elaborate bathing customs of noble households, including the use of attendants, scented towels, and even heated rooms to keep bathers warm. By contrast, chroniclers described peasants washing in rivers or ditches, fully clothed to preserve modesty, scrubbing only exposed skin. This class-based divide reinforced broader social hierarchies, with personal hygiene becoming another marker of privilege. Ultimately, the rich could afford to bathe for comfort and presentation, while the poor bathed for necessity. In an age when bathing frequency was lower overall, wealth determined whether the act was a private indulgence with pleasant surroundings or a quick, practical chore dictated by season and circumstance. These habits, shaped by resources as much as by belief, contributed to the enduring perception that clean was a relative concept in medieval life, one defined as much by class as by the amount of soap and water used. Clothing was a critical resource, and for peasants, one that was expensive to replace. A single set of garments could be worn for months on end, sometimes for an entire season, before being washed or swapped out. This was partly due to the high cost of materials and labour, but also because clothing had to be made to last. Unlike the wealthy, who could maintain multiple outfits for different occasions, most rural families owned only a handful of garments in total, often passed down or repaired until they were threadbare. For peasants, acquiring new clothing was a significant financial undertaking. Wool and linen were the primary fabrics, and even these required resources: shearing sheep, spinning yarn, weaving cloth that were labour-intensive and time-consuming. Tailors were rarely employed in rural settings. Instead, garments were made at home or purchased second-hand from markets. Many peasants received clothing as part of their payment for labour or rent, which meant they had little choice in style or fit. Because each piece was so valuable, it was worn continuously, layered in winter, and stripped to the bare minimum in summer to preserve the fabric from unnecessary wear. Frequent laundering was also uncommon, especially for heavy outer garments. Washing clothes was an arduous process involving fetching and heating water, scrubbing with harsh soap made from animal fat and lye, and drying in the open air. This work could take an entire day, and repeated washing weakened the fibres, shortening the garment's lifespan. As a result, most people washed their underclothes, if they owned them, more regularly, but their main garments only a few times a year. Seasonal cycles determined when clothing received a thorough cleaning. For example, spring festivals or autumn fairs might prompt a rare wash before wearing garments for public events. Layering also played a role in how long clothes went unwashed. Linen shifts or shirts were worn closest to the skin and absorbed much of the sweat and oils from the body. These could be washed more frequently, while the heavier wool tunics or gowns worn over them were spared constant cleaning. However, even undergarments might only be washed weekly or less, depending on water access and weather conditions. In winter, the cold discouraged washing altogether, both for personal comfort and to avoid damaging cloth that could freeze before drying. This approach to clothing was reinforced by cultural norms. Smelling of wood smoke, sweat, or the outdoors was not considered shameful. These scents were part of daily life and often went unnoticed. Cleanliness was defined less by the absence of odour and more by the absence of visible dirt or vermin. Mending was valued more than replacing, and a well-patched tunic could signify thrift and skill. Garments told the story of their wearer's labour, environment and resourcefulness, and wearing the same outfit for months was simply practical, not socially frowned upon. For modern readers, the idea of living in a single outfit for weeks or months may seem unthinkable, but in the medieval peasant world, it was the norm. Clothes were durable tools, not disposable commodities, and every stitch was made to serve its purpose for as long as possible. In that context, the one outfit for months habit was less about neglect and more about necessity, a way of conserving resources in a world where every scrap of cloth mattered. Wool and linen, the two most common fabrics worn by medieval Europeans, were prized for their durability, warmth, and availability. but they were also notorious for holding on to odours. For peasants who often wore the same garments, for these materials became a sort of archive of daily life, absorbing smoke from the hearth, sweat from labour, and the natural smells of the surrounding environment. Without modern detergents or frequent laundering, the build-up of scents in fabric was inevitable, and people simply accepted it as part of existence. Wool, in particular, was excellent for keeping the wearer warm and repelling light rain, thanks to the natural lanolin in the fibres. However, that same lanolin could trap oils, dirt, and odours, especially when garments were worn directly over unwashed skin. Because wool was expensive and prone to shrinking if washed improperly, heavy tunics and cloaks were rarely cleaned. Instead, they might be brushed, beaten outdoors to remove dust, or hung near a fire to dry and mask smells with smoke. While this helped preserve the material, it did nothing to remove deeper set odours. Smoke, sweat, and even the scent of livestock became part of the garment's identity over time. Linen, used mainly for undergarments like shirts and shifts, absorbed sweat and body oils readily, which is why it was usually the layer washed most often. Even so, washing linen was a laborious process that involved boiling it with ash-based soap or scrubbing it in cold water, and it was not done daily. The texture of unprocessed medieval linen meant that stains and smells could still linger after cleaning. This was particularly true in winter, when less washing was done and underclothes might be worn for weeks without a thorough rinse. In effect, linen acted as a sponge for odours, and though it was meant to protect outer garments from dirt, it carried its own unmistakable scent. Layering was both a blessing and a curse in terms of smell. A peasant might wear a linen shirt under a wool tunic with additional layers in cold weather. While this protected the skin from the abrasive wool and kept warmth in, it also created a multi-layer system in which sweat soaked through linen and slowly infused the wool above it. Without regular washing, every layer trapped and held the day's labour, whether it was the damp smell from working in the fields, the tang of animal hides from tending livestock, or the smoky residue from hours spent near an open hearth. Environmental factors also contributed. Clothing often absorbed the scent of the spaces where people lived and worked. A home heated by a peat or wood fire carried a different smell than one near a tannery or fish market, and these environmental scents became ingrained in fabric fibres. Unlike today, where deodorizing products can strip away most smells, medieval laundering methods could not fully remove them. Instead, people might air garments in the wind, sprinkle herbs between folds when storing them, or wear perfumed pouches to mask stronger odours. In the end, wool and linen were practical, durable and essential, but they were also part of why freshness in the modern sense was almost unattainable in medieval life. The materials themselves, combined with infrequent washing and constant exposure to work, fire and the outdoors, made odours an unavoidable part of personal presentation. Far from being a sign of neglect, it was simply the reality of living with the fabrics that defined the era. By the time a medieval garment was finally deemed dirty enough to wash, the process awaiting it was anything but simple. Laundry was not an everyday chore, but an event, physically demanding, time-consuming, and often requiring cooperation between family members or neighbours. This was especially true for heavier fabrics like wool, which could not simply be tossed into a tub of water without risk of shrinking or felting. Even linen, which was more frequently washed, demanded effort that made people think twice before committing to the task. The most accessible washing sites were natural water sources, rivers, streams, or communal washing areas near wells. Women, who were typically responsible for laundering, would carry loads of soiled linen to the water, sometimes walking considerable distances. The work began by soaking the garments, allowing dirt and oils to loosen before the main cleaning began. This was followed by beating the fabric against large, smooth stones or wooden boards. The pounding action forced water through the fibres, dislodging grime that could not be scrubbed away easily. This step was labour-intensive, requiring repetitive lifting and striking of heavy, waterlogged cloth for hours at a time. Soap, as we know it today, was rare and expensive. Instead, most people used lye-based cleaners made by leaching water through wood ash to create a caustic solution. Ash soap had strong cleaning power, particularly against grease and oils, but it was harsh on fabrics and skin. Linen could survive the treatment better than wool, which was more likely to be damaged by the alkaline wash. For wool items, gentler methods like brushing, airing, or lightly rinsing were preferred to avoid ruining the garment. In some regions, fuller's earth, a clay-like substance, was also used to absorb oils from cloth before rinsing. Rinsing was another essential but strenuous step. Without pumps or running water in homes, everything had to be carried or fetched. In rivers, the rinse came naturally from submerging the fabric and allowing the current to pull away the soap or ash. In areas without access to moving water, rinse water might have to be hauled repeatedly from a well or cistern, poured over the garments, and then collected again for reuse, though this meant clothing was never truly washed in clean water throughout the process. Drying was yet another consideration. Linen could be wrung out and hung on bushes, fences, or lines, where wind and sunlight did the rest. Wool, on the other hand, had to be dried carefully to prevent warping or felting, often laid flat in shaded areas. In winter, drying took much longer, and garments might be hung indoors near the hearth, adding a smoky note to whatever scents remained in the fabric. Because of the sheer effort involved, laundry days were infrequent and often turned into social events. In villages, communal washing spaces became gathering points where women exchanged news, shared tools, and helped each other manage particularly heavy loads. Still, the result of all this effort was rarely the crisp, fresh scent we associate with modern washing. The limitations of medieval cleaning methods meant that clothing might be visibly cleaner, but the deep-set odours from long wear, smoke, and the environment lingered. In short, washing clothes in the medieval period was far from a quick task. It was a major undertaking that shaped when and how people decided a garment truly needed cleaning. The work was as much about managing resources and preserving clothing as it was about achieving cleanliness. And it was this reality that kept many garments in long rotation before they ever saw the riverbank or pounding stone. On rare occasions, medieval clothing underwent what could be considered a deep clean, a process far more intense than the usual soaking, pounding, or brushing. This was the boiling of garments, a method reserved for specific situations and fabrics that could withstand such treatment. Linen, for example, was hardy enough to endure high heat without immediate ruin, making it a candidate for this drastic cleaning approach. Wool, however, was another matter entirely. Boiling wool could cause dramatic shrinking, thickening, and warping, transforming a tunic or hose into something barely wearable. Boiling was typically carried out when garments were heavily soiled, infested with lice or fleas, or when there was a need to disinfect them, such as during outbreaks of disease. The process often began by placing clothing in a large cauldron or copper vat filled with water, which was then heated over an open fire. Ash lye or other alkaline cleaning agents might be added to the water to help break down grease, sweat, and dirt. This solution was caustic enough to strip away more than just grime. It also wore down fibres over time, shortening the lifespan of the clothing. For many peasants, this method was a last resort because of the labour involved and the risk of damaging their limited wardrobe. Once water reached a rolling boil, garments had to be stirred or pressed down with long wooden poles, ensuring that every part of the fabric was submerged. The heat loosened deep-set dirt, but it also loosened the fibres themselves. Wool fibres, in particular, responded by matting together, a process known as felting. The result was a smaller, denser, and less flexible garment. What once had the shape and drape of a tunic could emerge from the cauldron closer to the size and stiffness of a child's coat. Because of these risks, boiling was more common in institutional settings, monasteries, hospitals, and wealthy households with larger linen supplies, where losing a garment was less catastrophic. Monasteries, in particular, kept to strict cleaning routines for bed linens and undergarments, both for hygiene and for the appearance of discipline. Boiling was also more frequent in military contexts, where uniforms, bedding and bandages needed thorough cleaning to reduce the spread of lice and infection. In these environments, the value of sanitation outweighed the potential cost of fabric damage. Once removed from the cauldron, garments were wrung out, which was no easy task when dealing with heavy, waterlogged linen or wool. Rinsing in clean water followed, if available, to remove the ashlie residue. Finally, drying had to be done with care, especially for shrunken or stiffened garments. Some items might be stretched while damp to regain a bit of their original shape, though this rarely restored them completely. The results of boiling varied widely. Linen emerged visibly cleaner and often lighter in colour, though repeated boiling could make it brittle over time. Wool, unless handled with exceptional care, was usually altered in texture and fit. For the poorest members of society, this could mean the loss of a precious garment, which is why most preferred gentler cleaning methods and accepted a certain level of embedded dirt and odour. Ultimately, boiling clothes was less about routine hygiene and more about necessity, a drastic measure for drastic circumstances. In a world where most people owned only a handful of garments, the decision to subject one to boiling was not made lightly. It was a gamble between cleanliness and preservation, and many opted to live with the grime rather than risk ending up with clothing they could no longer wear. By the late Middle Ages, most towns and cities in Europe still lacked anything resembling a centralised sewage system. Waste disposal was handled locally, and often quite literally, at the household level. Human waste, kitchen scraps and other refuse were typically gathered in buckets, chamber pots or simple wooden tubs. Once full, these were emptied into the nearest convenient location, which might be a pit latrine, a midden heap, or, all too often, directly into the street. Urban streets, particularly in poorer districts, could become open channels for waste. Many were unpaved or only crudely cobbled, with shallow gutters running down the middle to carry away rainwater, and whatever else residents tossed out. It was common practice to dump waste from an upper-storey window into the gutter below, sometimes with a shouted warning to pedestrians. The combination of organic refuse, animal dung from working beasts, and human excrement created an environment ripe for foul odours and the spread of disease, though medieval understanding of the latter was limited. In larger towns, cesspits or privy vaults were dug near homes, inns, or public buildings. These were essentially deep holes lined with stone or timber to hold waste. Over time, they would fill and require emptying, a task carried out by gong farmers or night soil men. These workers laboured mainly at night to avoid both the stench in the daytime and the disgust of passers-by. The collected waste could be carted away to the outskirts of town, sometimes dumped in rivers, other times sold as fertiliser to nearby farms. This reuse was practical, though risky, especially when contamination seeped into wells or streams. Rivers and streams themselves often served as waste disposal systems. In cities like London or Paris, smaller tributaries were effectively open sewers by the 14th century. Residents along the banks could tip refuse straight into the water, which might then carry it toward larger rivers. In theory, these waterways would flush waste away. In practice, they spread pollution downstream, affecting those who relied on the same rivers for drinking water, cooking, and washing. This reality contributed to the perception that water could be dangerous, particularly in densely populated areas. Animal waste was another persistent problem. Horses, oxen, donkeys, and pigs all moved through towns as working animals or livestock. Their droppings littered streets daily, mixing with mud and other debris. In some markets, pigs roamed freely, scavenging on discarded scraps and adding their own contribution to the waste problem. Periodic street cleaning was carried out by hired labourers or required of residents in certain districts, but it was irregular and often insufficient. Efforts to control waste varied by location and era. Some city councils issued ordinances requiring waste to be dumped outside town walls or into designated pits. Others banned throwing refuse into certain streets or waterways, though enforcement was inconsistent. Wealthier districts sometimes organised more regular cleaning, while poorer areas were left largely to manage themselves. Without an engineered sewage network, medieval urban waste disposal relied on proximity, convenience, and labour. This meant that what happened to waste depended heavily on where one lived and what resources were available. The result was an environment where smells were omnipresent, waste disposal was part of the daily routine, and fresh air was relative. While this system worked in the sense that life went on, it came with health risks and a baseline level of filth that shaped the sensory world of every medieval town dweller. In medieval towns and villages, animals were a constant and unavoidable presence. They were not just part of the agricultural landscape outside the walls. They lived, worked and roamed directly alongside humans in both rural and urban environments. This meant that they contributed heavily to the overall smellscape of daily life, adding their own layers to an already crowded mix of odours. Horses were among the most noticeable contributors. They were the main means of transportation for those who could afford them, and the primary source of power for carts, wagons and ploughs. In cities, they stood tethered in streets, stabled in small courtyards, or walked daily along market lanes. Each horse could produce several kilos of manure a day, much of which ended up in the road unless it was shoveled away, and removal was rarely immediate. The combination of horse manure and urine, particularly in hot weather, gave busy market streets a pungent, ever-present aroma. Pigs, especially in poorer districts and rural communities, often roamed freely. Medieval law in some towns even allowed pigs to scavenge in the streets, where they ate discarded scraps and spoiled food. This was practical waste disposal in one sense, but it meant that pigs were also contributing their own droppings wherever they went. Their rooting and wallowing could turn muddy streets into churned, filthy patches, especially after rain. In some places, they were kept in small pens close to houses, meaning the smell of pig waste was part of the background scent of home life. Chickens were equally common, kept for eggs and meat. They were often allowed to scratch freely around yards, gardens, and even indoor spaces. While their droppings were smaller, the sheer number of chickens in a settlement could make a noticeable difference, particularly when their coops were not cleaned often. Ducks and geese added their own messes, especially in areas near ponds or waterways. Cows and sheep, though more often pastured outside the busiest parts of towns, were driven through the streets on their way to markets or grazing grounds. A herd passing through could leave behind a trail of manure that stayed until rain or street cleaners cleared it away. In smaller villages, animals might be brought into barns attached to houses during winter for warmth, which meant their smells and the sounds of their movements were part of the domestic environment. The mingling of animal waste with human refuse, food scraps and stagnant water intensified the overall stench of medieval life. This wasn't necessarily shocking to the people of the time because they lived in constant contact with these smells from birth. However, for a modern nose, the combination of horse urine, pig manure, poultry droppings and general street waste would be overpowering. Animal presence was essential to survival. They provided labour, transport, food, leather and wool, but it came with the unavoidable reality of more waste in public spaces. Town regulations sometimes required owners to keep animals penned or to clean up after them, but enforcement varied and practicality often won out over sanitation. In many ways, animals were as much citizens of medieval settlements as humans were, shaping not just the economy and diet, but the sensory world of every street and alley. Open-air markets were the heart of medieval commerce, but they also played a major role in shaping the smells and sights of daily life. With no refrigeration, limited evasion methods, and goods often displayed in the open air for hours or even days, spoilage was an inevitable part of the trading process. For anyone walking through a busy marketplace, the mixture of aromas could be dizzying. Freshly baked bread, herbs, roasting meat, but also the sour tang of spoiled fish, rotting vegetables, and meat that had been sitting in the sun too long. Butchers' stalls were among the most potent contributors. Meat was often butchered in the morning and sold throughout the day, hanging from hooks or laid out on tables. In summer heat, cuts could start to turn by midday, especially if flies were abundant. While vendors did their best to keep products looking presentable, sometimes rinsing meat in water or sprinkling herbs to mask the smell, buyers often knew they had to cook it quickly to avoid illness. Any trimmings, offal or unsold cuts were either discarded nearby or sold cheaply before they spoiled entirely, which meant that piles of meat scraps could linger at the edges of the market. Fishmongers had similar challenges. Fresh fish was highly perishable, and in inland towns it might already be hours or days old by the time it arrived. Vendors stored it on damp cloths or in barrels, but without ice, the odour was unmistakable. During fasting periods, when fish demand surged, the strain on supply could lead to poorer quality stock being sold. In coastal towns, markets were closer to the source, but the smell of fish waste, guts, scales and heads, was still a regular part of the environment. Vegetable and fruit sellers added their own scents to the mix. Produce came from nearby fields, gardens or orchards, but with no modern packaging, it sat exposed to sun, wind and handling. Soft fruits bruised quickly, greens wilted and root vegetables began to soften and rot. These items weren't always thrown away immediately. Many were sold at reduced prices to poorer customers who couldn't afford fresher goods. The result was a market floor often littered with bruised apples, split cabbages and discarded leaves. Cheese and dairy sellers had their own olfactory presence. Some cheeses were intentionally pungent, but others became unpleasant if left too long in the sun. Butter could go rancid, milk soured quickly, and without sealed containers, spills and drips were common. All of these added to the market's layered scent profile, which mingled with the smells of nearby animal pens, manure, and unwashed bodies. Cleaning was inconsistent. Some towns employed market sweepers or required vendors to clear their stalls, but in many places waste simply accumulated until the end of the day, or longer. Stray dogs, pigs and birds often scavenged through the leavings, scattering food waste and making clean-up harder. Despite the unsanitary conditions, markets were essential hubs of community life. People came not only to buy and sell, but to meet neighbours, hear news and socialise. For medieval people, the mixture of pleasant and foul smells was part of the expected sensory background. Freshness was measured differently. A fish that was a bit strong might still be considered good enough, and vegetables with some wilt could be revived in a pot. The very idea of off-food was more flexible, shaped by necessity and habit. When market waste, animal manure and general refuse already filled the streets, the weather could turn an unpleasant situation into something far worse. In medieval towns and cities, rain was not the cleansing force we think of today. Without paved roads or proper drainage, even a short shower could transform dirt streets into a slurry of mud, dung and rotting food scraps. People trudging through the muck tracked it into their homes and shops, grinding the filth deeper into floors and thresholds. The combination of organic waste and constant foot and cart traffic meant that the surface of a medieval street was never truly clean. When it rained, stagnant puddles formed in the wheel ruts and depressions, sometimes tinted with the runoff from tanneries, dye works or butcher shops. These puddles didn't just smell bad, they were breeding grounds for bacteria and insects. Children splashed through them, animals drank from them, and carts rolled straight through, spraying the mix onto passers-by. In winter, the problem often grew worse. Melted snow carried accumulated waste from months of cold weather neglect, releasing smells that had been muted in freezing temperatures. Spring thaw was notorious for its stench, as layers of manure spoiled produce and general garbage liquefied and spread through the streets. Even in the warm months, heavy summer rain could stir up the same effect, only now in sweltering heat when odours became more intense. Medieval cities lacked the concept of a sealed sewer system. Instead, rainwater acted as the primary force moving waste along, either toward open ditches or directly into nearby rivers. This runoff often passed through markets and residential lanes, carrying with it spoiled meat scraps, vegetable peelings, animal droppings and human waste. Because of the close proximity of drinking water sources to waste channels, contamination was a constant risk. Still, few saw the link between rain-borne filth and illness. The stench was accepted as an inevitable part of city life. Mud itself was a hazard. It clung to the hems of long garments, making them heavier and more difficult to clean. It coated the hooves of animals and the wheels of carts, then dried and flaked into dust when the weather turned dry. Dust that carried the residue of whatever had been in the street days before. That meant a walk through town could coat a person's legs with muck one day and their lungs with dust the next. The sensory impact was unavoidable. A walk through a medieval city after a downpour was an assault of sights and smells. The splash of carts hitting deep puddles, the slippery slide of a boot in manure-thick mud, the sharp odour of fresh dung mingled with the sour reek of old rot. People adapted by wearing heavier shoes or pattens to keep their feet above the worst of it, but nothing kept the smell from clinging. For medieval townsfolk, the weather didn't just change the atmosphere, it actively shaped it. Rain didn't wash the streets clean, it simply rearranged the filth, spreading it into every corner of urban life. This meant that the scent of a city wasn't constant, it had moods. After days of dry weather, it might be dusty and faintly musty. After rain, it was earthy, sour, and overpoweringly alive with the odours of everything the water had disturbed. After the rain and mud had spread the smells of the street into every corner, there was still another layer to the medieval scentscape, one carried not by the weather but by the people themselves. In towns and villages across Europe, diet played a direct role in how individuals, households, and even entire communities smelled. Chief among the contributors were staple foods like onions, garlic, and cabbage, cheap, filling, and almost universally available. These ingredients were not seasoning in the modern sense, but bulk food. Onions and garlic grew well in most soils, kept for long periods without spoiling, and could flavour otherwise bland porridges, potages, and breads. They were also thought to have medicinal properties, making them as common in the apothecary's kit as in the kitchen. Yet, eating them daily in large quantities meant the scent seeped into sweat, breath, and clothing. In communities where bathing and laundering were infrequent, those odours lingered far longer than a single meal. Cabbage was another staple that carried its own distinctive mark. While nutritious and hardy, cabbage releases sulfur compounds both when cooked and when digested, producing a smell that could permeate kitchens, garments, and even the small gas-enclosed rooms where people slept. Because boiling was a primary cooking method, villages were often filled with the pungent steam of simmering brassicas, especially in the cooler months when fresh greens were scarce and stored cabbages became the main vegetable source. The combination of these foods with the reality of medieval living spaces amplified their impact. In a one-room cottage, the same fire that cooked the family meal also heated the sleeping space, meaning that food smells and the body odours they encouraged were trapped indoors. With that heat and the closeness of bodies, the scent of garlic or boiled cabbage could mix with smoke, wool, and unwashed linen into a signature household aroma that was entirely normal to its inhabitants. Travellers often remarked on these differences when moving from one region to another. Chroniclers from areas with milder diets sometimes described the people of garlic-heavy regions as particularly fragrant in their speech and sweat. But these remarks were not always meant as insults. In many cases, they simply noted the strong association between food and personal smell, much like modern travellers might notice the prevalence of certain spices or cooking oils in a region. For medieval people, the scent of these foods was not a marker of poor hygiene in the way we might think today. Instead, it was part of the rhythm of daily life, as natural as the smell of wood smoke or freshly turned soil. In some contexts, it was even valued. Garlic and onions were believed to ward off illness, and a person who carried their scent might be considered more robust or less vulnerable to disease. Soldiers, labourers, and travellers often carried them as portable provisions, meaning their smell was also tied to strength, endurance, and readiness for work. However, this acceptance did not mean everyone enjoyed the aroma. In wealthier households, cooks sometimes used herbs, vinegar, or wine to temper the more potent effects of cabbage and garlic, particularly for guests. In towns with more market variety, the poor might supplement their staple vegetables with seasonal fruits or beans, but the basic diet still relied heavily on the same pungent plants. Even when other foods were available, onions and cabbage were cheap insurance against hunger, and hunger was far worse than any lingering odour. The persistence of these scents in clothing and bedding also meant that they were portable. A person walking into a church, market, or alehouse might carry the smell of their midday meal with them, blending into the collective aroma of the crowd. And in a world without perfumes, deodorants, or frequent changes of clothing for most people, this layering of diet-driven scents became one of the defining features of medieval smell. From the street outside to the hearth inside, onions, garlic and cabbage were as much a part of the air as smoke or rain-damp wool. They fed the body and marked the people who ate them, not as individuals with peculiar diets, but as members of a community sustained by the same fields, the same seasons and the same enduring crops. After the ever-present smells of onions, garlic and cabbage, another major contributor to medieval breath and body odour came from drinking habits. Ale and mead were not just beverages for social occasions, they were staples of daily life for both peasants and the wealthy. Water sources, especially in towns, were often contaminated, making alcohol-based drinks a safer option. As a result, people of all ages consumed weak ale, sometimes called small beer, throughout the day, while stronger brews and mead were reserved for feasts or special events. Ale was typically brewed locally and consumed quickly without the sterilising or filtering processes we expect today. It could be thick, cloudy and full of yeast residue which would cling to the mouth and teeth. Mead, made from fermented honey, left a sweeter but equally persistent coating. Both drinks, consumed in large quantities and without modern dental care, created an environment in the mouth where bacteria could thrive, contributing to what we'd now call chronic bad breath. Oral hygiene in medieval Europe varied by region and class, but for most people it was basic and infrequent. There were no toothbrushes as we know them, and certainly no toothpaste. Some households used linen rags or chewed on twigs to scrub teeth, and there are records of herbal mouth rinses made from mint, rosemary or sage. However, these were often seasonal or only used when materials were available. For many, the daily routine of eating coarse bread, drinking ale and perhaps rinsing with plain water was the full extent of oral care. The combination of diet and drink meant that morning breath was rarely just a morning problem, it was a constant presence. A person might wake with the sour tang of fermentation lingering from the previous evening's drinking, only to start the day with more ale at breakfast. The smell was compounded by the high sugar content of mead and the malty residue of ale, both of which fed bacteria and intensified odours over time. Social norms played a key role in how this was perceived. Since nearly everyone drank ale or mead regularly, the associated smells were not considered offensive in the same way they might be today. In fact, the scent of ale on the breath could be associated with conviviality, hospitality and good company. In taverns, markets and homes, it was simply part of the human atmosphere. The wealthy sometimes had more elaborate ways to freshen their mouths, such as chewing cloves or anise seeds, or rinsing with wine mixed with herbs. These practices were both for scent and for perceived health benefits, as some believed certain spices could ward off illness. However, even in noble households, ale and mead were constant fixtures, and strong-smelling breath was far from rare. Chroniclers and travellers occasionally commented on the drinking habits of certain regions, noting differences in strength and flavour of local brews. Some implied that stronger ales produced heavier breath, while others described mead as leaving a sweet but cloying odour. Yet these observations were usually matter of fact, without moral judgment, reflecting how normalised these scents were. In a world without mints, chewing gum, or commercial mouthwash, the smells of ale, mead, and poor dental hygiene merged seamlessly into daily life. Morning breath was not a private embarrassment, but part of the shared sensory experience of medieval living. As ordinary as the clink of a tankard or the smell of the hearth fire, it was the scent of sustenance, safety, and social connection, even if it came with a hint of yeast and honey. By the late Middle Ages, the lack of refrigeration meant meat was a gamble from the moment it was butchered to the moment it reached the table. In towns and cities, cuts of beef, pork or mutton were often displayed in open-air markets, exposed to sunlight, dust and the constant haze of flies. Without ice or cold storage, the window for freshness was short, sometimes just a matter of hours in warm weather. But meat was valuable, and no merchant or household wanted to waste it, so once the freshness passed, they relied on other methods to make it palatable. Spices, vinegar and heavy salting became both a flavour choice and a practical necessity, masking the smell and taste of meat that was edging toward or well past safe consumption. Medieval cooks had a range of tricks to disguise questionable meat. Pepper, ginger, cloves and cinnamon, All expensive imports were sometimes added to sauces and stews, not just for taste, but to cover signs of spoilage. Vinegar and wine marinades could help reduce the smell, while salt, when affordable, slowed bacterial growth. In wealthier kitchens, elaborate dishes used spice blends so intense they overwhelmed the meat's natural scent, making it difficult to detect if the cut had begun to turn. For the poor, the options were more limited. Strong-smelling herbs like sage, garlic and onion were the most common tools for masking flavour, but these did little to stop the risks. Illness from spoiled meat was an accepted hazard, though people often misattributed the cause. Rather than linking sickness to bacterial contamination, an unknown concept, they might blame bad air, imbalances of the humours, or even divine punishment. This meant that rather than discarding suspect food, people were more likely to alter how they prepared it. Stewing was especially popular because long cooking times and boiling liquid could improve texture and mask sourness. It did nothing to remove dangerous toxins, but it made the dish edible in the moment. The wealthy had the advantage of turnover. Game, poultry and livestock could be slaughtered on demand within their estates, giving them fresher meat more consistently. Still, even noble feasts could include meat that had travelled over days, salted heavily in barrels or smoked to extend its life. While this preserved the meat, it also altered its flavour and texture so completely that diners might not recognise the original taste. Some dishes we think of as traditional medieval flavours were in part the result of necessity. The spice-laden sauces of courtly banquets were as much about safety as indulgence. In poorer households, meat was rarer and often consumed in small amounts, stretched within pottages or pies. This reduced the risk slightly, but it also meant that when meat was obtained through markets, barter or seasonal slaughter, it was eaten regardless of condition. For rural peasants, preservation often meant salting, drying or smoking at home, but these methods required resources that were not always available. In hard winters or during shortages, a family might knowingly consume meat that was well past its prime simply because the alternative was going hungry. Markets themselves were a source of mixed smells, fresh cuts alongside those well into decline, blood pooling on wooden tables, and scraps swept into gutters where they rotted openly. But for the medieval consumer, these odours were part of daily life. The line between fresh and spoiled was not as sharply drawn as today. So long as food could be chewed and swallowed without immediate revulsion, it might find its way into the pot. The heavy hand with spices that defines much of late medieval cooking was not just a matter of luxury, it was quite often survival. By the late Middle Ages, salted fish had become a dietary staple for much of Europe, especially for those living far from the coasts. Cod, herring and other species were preserved in heavy layers of salt, sometimes combined with drying to make them last through long winters or transport over land. This preservation method allowed for storage over months, but it came at a sensory cost. Salted fish carried a deep, penetrating odour that lingered not just in kitchens, but in clothing, breath and the general atmosphere of a home. Unlike fresh fish, whose scent was relatively mild if cooked promptly, preserved fish released an aroma that intensified with every soak, boil or frying in the hearth's pan. The process that created this smell was rooted in necessity. Without refrigeration, salting was one of the only reliable means of preventing spoilage, especially for protein-rich foods that could rot quickly. Fishermen salted their catches at sea or in dockside curing houses, where barrels of brine and fish stood in close, damp quarters. These storage barrels absorbed the smell and, over time, the surrounding area often did as well. Wooden piers, fishing sheds, and even the clothing of those who worked there became permeated with the pungent mix of salt, fish oil, and decay-resistant compounds. By the time such goods reached inland towns, the smell had already settled deep into the product. In many households, particularly poorer ones, salted fish was not only a common meal, but sometimes the only source of meat-like protein for days at a time. The preparation routine, soaking the slabs in water to draw out excess salt, created its own strong odour, especially in homes without separate kitchens. Steam from boiling or frying spread the scent quickly, clinging to hair and cloth. In a world where ventilation was minimal and smoke from the hearth already thickened the air, the added layer of fish odour could be overwhelming by modern standards. Yet to medieval noses, it was as unremarkable as the smell of fresh bread or wood smoke. Religious practices also played a major role in how often salted fish appeared on the table. The medieval Christian calendar included many fast days, sometimes over 150 a year, when the consumption of meat from warm-blooded animals was forbidden. On these days, fish became the preferred substitute, and for much of the population, that meant salted fish rather than fresh. This high frequency of consumption reinforced the association between everyday life and the smell of brined seafood. Merchants dealing in salted fish knew that its marketability depended more on its ability to survive transport than on its aroma. Buyers judged quality by the firmness of the flesh and the degree of preservation, not by pleasantness of scent. In fact, a particularly strong smell could even be interpreted as a sign of potency or effectiveness, much like the sharp tang of well-aged cheese. For coastal exporters like those in the Hanseatic League, the odour was simply part of the trade's identity. The lingering nature of salted fish smell extended well beyond mealtime. In communal dining areas, the scent could remain for hours after eating, absorbed into the rough-hewn wooden tables and benches. In clothing, especially wool, it could persist for days. Even in public markets, the fishmongers' stalls formed an olfactory landmark, one that visitors noted in travel diaries and letters. The smell was not universally liked, but it was universally familiar. In short, salted fish was an essential part of medieval life, both nutritionally and economically, but its strong and persistent odour left its mark on the sensory world of the period. For modern observers, it serves as a reminder that in a pre-refrigeration age, smell was an unavoidable companion to survival. In the medieval experience, it was simply one more note in the dense, layered symphony of daily living. By the standards of the medieval world, the absence of a toothbrush and modern toothpaste was not considered unhygienic. Tooth care existed, but it looked very different from today's routines and was shaped by the tools, materials and beliefs available at the time. The idea of scrubbing teeth with a bristled brush on a daily schedule would not appear in Europe until much later, and even then it spread slowly. Instead, medieval people relied on a mix of improvised cleaning methods, herbal remedies and dietary habits to keep their mouths functional, if not minty fresh by modern expectations. One of the simplest and most common practices was the use of toothpicks, often made from wood, bone or metal. Written accounts and archaeological finds show that personal grooming kits sometimes included these tools, which were used to dislodge food from between the teeth after meals. Wealthier individuals might own decorative, reusable toothpicks carried in small cases, while poorer people made do with whatever small sticks they could whittle smooth. In many cultures, these picks were as much a sign of refinement as they were a health measure, showing that one cared about personal appearance at the table. Chewing sticks, or miswaks in the Islamic world, were also known in Europe through contact with the Middle East, particularly after the Crusades. These were small twigs, often from aromatic or mildly antiseptic plants, chewed on until the fibres frayed into a brush-like tip. Hazel, birch and fruit tree branches could serve this purpose. People would rub these fibrous ends along their teeth to remove debris and freshen the breath. The practice offered mild cleaning action, introduced plant compounds that could help fight bacteria, even if medieval users didn't understand the microbial basis of decay. Herbal powders and pastes served as another form of cleaning. Recipes for tooth powder appear in medieval manuscripts, often made from crushed herbs, dried flowers, powdered charcoal, and ground oyster or cuttlefish shells. Salt was another common ingredient used for its abrasive quality. These powders could be rubbed directly onto the teeth with a cloth or fingertip. Some mixtures were designed to whiten teeth, though their abrasive nature could also wear down enamel over time. Vinegar or wine might be used as a rinse, not only to loosen debris, but also because they were believed to have cleansing or medicinal properties. The cultural definition of a clean mouth was tied more to visible appearance and social perception than to the prevention of cavities. Medieval diets, particularly for the poor, contained fewer refined sugars than modern ones, meaning tooth decay was less rampant than it would later become in the sugar-rich centuries after European contact with the New World. Coarse bread, fibrous vegetables and tough meats naturally help scrape plaque from teeth during chewing. This mechanical cleaning effect, combined with periodic herbal treatments, meant that a completely neglected mouth was rarer than one might expect. However, bad breath was a known and complained about issue, and many tooth cleaning efforts were aimed at freshening the breath rather than removing plaque. Chewing herbs such as parsley, mint or cloves was a common solution, and cloves in particular were prized for their strong scent and numbing qualities. In wealthier households, spiced wine or infused water might be swished in the mouth before important social encounters. The tools and methods available were limited, but they formed a part of daily grooming for those who could manage them. In towns, markets often sold small bundles of herbs or mouth sweeteners alongside other household necessities, and travellers carried toothpicks or chewing sticks in their personal belongings. Even without a modern understanding of oral health, people recognised the benefits of clearing food from their teeth, masking odours, and maintaining a pleasant appearance in social settings. By modern dental standards, these habits were far from perfect, and medieval mouths bore the signs of wear, gum disease, and occasional decay. Yet for the time, they were practical, resourceful solutions, an improvised form of hygiene shaped by the realities of limited materials, different diets, and cultural priorities. From a handful of mint leaves to a chewed twig, medieval tooth care was less about fighting plaque with precision and more about managing the visible and social signs of oral neglect. By the late Middle Ages, sugar had begun to reshape European diets, and with it the condition of people's teeth and the smells that accompanied poor oral health. Before the widespread import of sugar from Mediterranean plantations and later from colonies in the Americas, medieval Europeans consumed very little refined sweetness. Most sweet foods came from honey, dried fruits, or naturally sugary wines. These were expensive and limited, especially for the peasantry. But as trade routes expanded in the 13th and 14th centuries, sugar slowly made its way into more kitchens, first among the wealthy and eventually in urban markets, where small amounts could be purchased for special occasions. Sugar was prized as both a luxury ingredient and a medicinal substance. Apothecaries sold it mixed with spices, herbs, and rosewater to make syrups, lozenges, and candied remedies. In elite households, chefs used sugar not only to sweeten, but also to preserve fruits, coat nuts, and create elaborate confectionery displays. Yet the same qualities that made sugar so appealing, its stickiness, its ability to cling to food surfaces, and its chemical reaction with oral bacteria, made it harmful to teeth. Once sugar became more common in elite diets, chronic tooth decay began to appear in skeletal remains of wealthier individuals at higher rates than in the rural poor. The link between sugar and odour was not understood in medical terms at the time, but its effects were noticed. Decayed teeth, especially when untreated, could develop abscesses and gum disease, both of which produced a distinctive foul breath. Contemporary literature sometimes mocked nobles for their honeyed but rotting smiles, suggesting that overindulgence in sweets was both a moral and physical flaw. Physicians of the period often prescribed aromatic rinses, infusions of wine, vinegar or herbs to counteract bad breath, but these could not reverse the underlying dental damage. For the lower classes, sugar was less of a daily hazard, but the growing availability of cheap sweet treats in towns, like candied almonds sold at fairs or honey-sweetened pastries, meant that even occasional indulgence could contribute to decay over time. The issue was compounded by the absence of consistent tooth-cleaning tools. Once sugar lodged between teeth or along the gum line, it could remain there for hours or days, feeding bacteria that caused both cavities and the sulfurous compounds responsible for halitosis. The cultural perception of sweetness complicated the matter. In medieval diet theory, foods were classified according to their humoral qualities: hot, cold, moist, dry, and sugar was considered a balanced, almost healthful ingredient when consumed in moderation. It was believed to strengthen the chest, aid digestion, and lift the spirits. This meant that even when toothaches were linked to sweet foods, They were often framed as the unfortunate price of enjoying a socially prestigious and medically beneficial substance. As sugar use spread through the Renaissance, so did the symptoms: visible tooth blackening, crumbling molars, and persistent oral odour, especially among the wealthy. Visitors from regions with less sugar in the diet sometimes remarked on the state of European teeth and breath, hinting at a growing association between refined sweetness and unpleasant smells. These observations reinforced the divide between urban elites and rural populations, as country dwellers, though poorer, often had better-smelling breath simply because their diet remained low in refined sugar. In this way, sugar became an early example of a status food that carried hidden health costs. It sweetened drinks, decorated feasts, and served as a sign of refinement, but it also contributed to one of the most socially noticeable hygiene problems of the medieval and early modern world. And in an age without dentists as we know them, that combination of decay and odour was often permanent, an enduring reminder that luxury could sometimes be the quickest path to discomfort. Tooth loss and gum disease were common consequences of the diet, hygiene habits, and medical limitations described earlier, and their effects went far beyond physical discomfort. In a world without modern dentistry, a rotting tooth or inflamed gums could remain untreated for years, eventually leading to partial or complete tooth loss. This wasn't just a matter of appearance. It altered the way people spoke, the foods they could eat, and even how they were perceived socially. Speech was one of the most noticeable areas impacted. Teeth are vital for producing certain consonant sounds, especially those requiring the tongue to press against the teeth, like th, f, and v. When front teeth were missing, speech could develop a whistling or slurred quality. Chronic gum disease, known today as periodontitis, could also affect clarity of speech by causing swelling, pain, or shifting teeth that changed tongue placement. Medieval people would have recognized these changes, and in some cases they became part of a person's reputation or nickname. For instance, written records occasionally describe individuals as lisping or gummy, terms that likely carried both descriptive and mocking tones. Smell was another unavoidable outcome. Gum disease often produces halitosis due to the presence of bacterial infections and decaying tissue. In severe cases, abscesses could form, releasing pus with an unmistakably foul odour. Combined with poor access to consistent cleaning, whether by herbal rinses, cloth rubs, or chewing sticks, the mouth could become a persistent source of unpleasant smell. This was exacerbated by diets heavy in onions, garlic, and preserved meats, which could linger on the breath for hours, and by the habit of drinking ale or mead daily, which could dry the mouth and worsen bacterial growth. Medical understanding of these conditions was limited. Medieval physicians and barber surgeons often treated gum disease with cauterization, herbal poultices, or extractions. Removing a tooth might temporarily relieve pain, but could cause further problems, as gaps in the mouth allowed remaining teeth to drift, changing the bite and making chewing less effective. A peasant who lost too many molars might struggle to grind coarse bread or tough meat, leading to reliance on softer foods like pottage. Among the wealthy, missing front teeth could mar the otherwise fashionable appearance expected at court, though sugar-rich diets meant this was an increasingly common problem, even in elite circles. Despite these challenges, there was little stigma attached to the smell of oral disease in the way we think of it today. Chronic odours were part of the shared environment, and without a strong cultural expectation of minty freshness, bad breath was simply one more sensor in a world already full of strong odours from people, animals, and industry. That said, persistent halitosis and slurred or whistling speech could still affect interpersonal interactions, especially in settings like trade negotiations, church gatherings, or courtship, where clear communication and personal presence mattered. Ultimately, tooth loss and gum disease in the medieval period were less about individual neglect and more about the intersection of diet, limited hygiene tools, and the absence of preventive dentistry. The results shaped not only personal health but also the sound and smell of daily life, a reality that would linger for centuries until advances in medical knowledge, oral hygiene practices, and public health campaigns began to change what people expected from their own mouths. In a world without toothpaste or mint-flavoured mouthwash, medieval people relied on a combination of folk remedies, herbal knowledge and superstition to address bad breath. These practices varied widely by region and social class, but they shared one feature. They blended practical observation with beliefs that would seem unusual today. Herbs were the most common tools. Parsley, mint, sage and rosemary were frequently chewed after meals, not only to mask odour but also because they were believed to aid digestion. These herbs contained natural oils with mild antibacterial properties, though medieval people wouldn't have described them in scientific terms. Instead, they spoke of their warming or cooling qualities within the framework of humoral theory, believing that balancing the body's internal temperament could correct foul breath. In rural areas, chewing fennel or dill seeds was another everyday habit, both for flavour and for the belief that these seeds could sweeten the mouth and calm stomach vapours, which were thought to be a source of unpleasant smells. Spices played a role too, especially among the wealthy who could afford them. Cloves, cinnamon and cardamom were imported luxuries that doubled as breath fresheners. Their intense scent could overpower other odours, and they were sometimes carried in small pouches to be chewed discreetly during church or court gatherings. Poorer households might substitute with local aromatic seeds or wild plants, such as anise or juniper berries. Superstition also shaped oral hygiene. Some remedies had no botanical basis at all, but were rooted in symbolic thinking. One folk belief held that carrying a piece of nutmeg or a dried fig in the pocket would ward off bad breath by drawing out foul humours from the body. In certain areas, people believed that rubbing the gums with a silver coin could absorb illness-causing vapours, a practice blending magical thinking with the high status associated with precious metals. Others saw bad breath as a sign of moral or spiritual corruption, leading to prayers or charms intended to cleanse both body and soul. There were also mixtures designed to be rinsed in the mouth, often involving vinegar, wine or herbal infusions. Vinegar was especially common, valued for its sharp scent and perceived cleansing ability. Some households steeped herbs in wine and swished the liquid before swallowing, combining the effects of alcohol as a disinfectant, albeit mild, with the aroma of the herbs. Despite these efforts, bad breath remained a normal part of life. Folk remedies could only do so much against chronic gum disease, tooth decay, or a diet heavy in onions, garlic and preserved meats. Yet these practices were more than just attempts at oral hygiene. They were part of a broader medieval approach to health that intertwined medicine, diet, religion and tradition. Remedies were passed down through generations, refined by local knowledge and shaped by the plants and materials available in each community. In the absence of modern dentistry, these methods reflected both ingenuity and the limits of medieval science. They reveal a world where scent was managed rather than eliminated, and where the line between medicine and magic was far blurrier than it is today. Hair hygiene in the medieval period followed a rhythm very different from modern expectations. For most people, washing hair was an infrequent activity, sometimes occurring only a few times a year, because both the process and the beliefs around health discouraged frequent wetting of the head. This meant that natural oils, dust and odours would gradually accumulate, creating a distinct texture and smell that was considered normal at the time. Part of the reason was purely practical. Soap, especially for the body, was not always easy to obtain, and specialised hair washing products simply didn't exist. The soaps that were available were often harsh, made from lye and animal fats, and could strip hair of its natural oils to the point of leaving it dry and brittle. For this reason, many people prefer not to wash their hair often, instead relying on combing to maintain some level of cleanliness. Wooden, bone or horn combs were common tools, used daily to remove tangles, dust, lice and other debris. Cultural beliefs about health also played a role. Medieval medical thought, heavily influenced by humoral theory, held that excessive bathing or washing could weaken the body. Wetting the head was sometimes thought to allow harmful vapours or cold air to enter through the scalp and cause illness. In colder months, the risk of catching a chill was a genuine concern, so hair washing was avoided almost entirely in winter. Instead, people might rub the scalp with cloths to remove excess grease or use powders made from crushed herbs, flowers, or even ground oats to absorb oil and add fragrance. For wealthier individuals, scented powders and perfumed oils could mask odours and create the impression of cleanliness without full washing. Rosemary, lavender, and rose petals were common ingredients, both for their pleasant smell and their association with warding off disease. Peasants, by contrast, relied more on local plants like sage or mint when available, or simply combed hair thoroughly without any fragrance at all. In rural communities, hair washing might coincide with major bathing events, such as visits to a bathhouse before important holidays or seasonal fairs. In these cases, hair could be rinsed in warm water, sometimes with the addition of herbs or lye soap, but this was a rare treat rather than a routine. Between washes, the natural build-up of sebum gave hair a heavier, sometimes matted texture. While this would be considered unkempt by modern standards, it was entirely ordinary for medieval people and did not carry the same social stigma. Even head coverings played a part. Men and women often wore hats, hoods, veils, or coifs, which helped protect hair from dirt but also trapped heat and oils. This created a distinctive lived-in scent that blended with the smells of hearth smoke, cooking, and the outdoors. Since everyone was accustomed to it, such odours were not viewed as offensive in the way they might be today. By modern measures, medieval hair care was minimal, but it was shaped by the realities of labour, climate, resources, and belief. Cleanliness was achieved through maintenance rather than frequent washing, combing, covering, and scenting rather than stripping and rinsing. Over time, the layers of oil and the scents of daily life became part of a person's natural presence, woven into the broader smellscape of the medieval world. Parasites such as lice, fleas, and mites were a constant presence in medieval life, cutting across all social classes. The combination of infrequent bathing, layered clothing, close living quarters, and the presence of domestic animals created an ideal environment for these pests to thrive. While today they are primarily associated with discomfort and disease, in the medieval world they also contributed to the overall smellscape in subtle but persistent ways. Lice, particularly head lice, were so common that delousing was a routine social activity. People might sit together by the hearth, picking lice and nits from one another's hair and clothing. This was often treated as an ordinary act, not a shameful one. The odour associated with lice infestations came less from the insects themselves and more from the unwashed hair and clothing they inhabited. Layers of body oils, sweat and dirt in the scalp and on linens created a warm, slightly sour environment that both harboured and sustained these parasites. Fleas were even harder to avoid, especially in homes where straw bedding, thatched roofs and animals shared the same space. Many households kept chickens, pigs or goats indoors during certain seasons, bringing their own fleas into human sleeping areas. Fleas could leave behind a faint, musty smell mixed with that of bedding that was rarely washed. In warm weather, flea droppings and shed skins might accumulate in bed straw, adding to the stale scent of the room. Mites, particularly scabies mites, brought their own problems. Infestations could cause intense itching, leading to scratching that broke the skin. Infected sores and scabs sometimes developed unpleasant odours if they became inflamed or unclean. Beyond personal discomfort, the smell of infected skin lesions could contribute to the background scents of a household, especially in confined winter quarters. Efforts to control these infestations were primitive by modern standards. Boiling clothes and bedding could kill lice and fleas, but this was done infrequently because of the labour involved and the risk of shrinking or damaging garments. More often, people relied on sunning their clothes outdoors, shaking bedding, or sprinkling herbs such as lavender, pennyroyal or wormwood into straw mattresses. These herbs had strong scents that could temporarily mask odours and sometimes repel pests, but they did not eliminate the problem. Wealthier households might have more resources for control, better laundering, more frequent changes of linen, or bedding that could be replaced more easily. But even in castles, parasites were reported. Travellers' accounts and personal letters mention the discomfort of fleas and lice in noble halls, as well as peasant huts. The difference was often in the degree of masking rather than the complete removal of the problem. In such an environment, the faint smells of pests, combined with human sweat, animal presence, and unwashed fabrics, were simply part of daily life. People's noses adjusted, and the presence of lice or fleas was treated as a nuisance rather than a crisis. The idea of a completely parasite-free household would have been almost unimaginable in most medieval communities. Animal fat played an important role in medieval grooming, serving as a multi-purpose moisturizer long before the invention of creams, lotions, or commercial cosmetics. Tallow from sheep or cattle, lard from pigs, and rendered fat from deer or goats were all readily available byproducts of butchering. For most households, wasting such resources was unthinkable, so these fats found uses not only in cooking and candle making, but also in personal care. Applying fat to skin was an established, if unrefined, beauty and health practice that bridged both necessity and tradition. For people living in a world of harsh weather, outdoor labour, and infrequent bathing, dry skin was a year-round problem. Winter winds and summer sun both caused chapping, cracking, and flaking, especially on the face, hands, and feet. Without modern ointments, animal fat was one of the few substances that could provide a protective barrier. When rubbed into the skin, it softened rough patches and helped seal in whatever natural moisture remained. In this sense, it was functional, less about beauty in the modern sense, and more about keeping skin intact and preventing painful sores. The preparation of fat for cosmetic use varied. Freshly rendered fat could be stored in small pots or wrapped in cloth for later application. Sometimes it was scented with herbs like rosemary, lavender, or thyme to improve its smell and perhaps reduce the risk of rancidity. However, the scent was often faint, and in poorer households, unperfumed fat would have been used directly. Over time, fat stored in warm conditions could develop a strong odour, blending with the natural smells of unwashed skin and clothing. This meant that while it made skin more supple, it could also contribute to the complex personal scent people carried with them. Animal fat wasn't just applied to exposed skin. It could be worked into the scalp to tame flyaway hair, smooth braids, or protect against lice, sometimes in combination with crushed herbs intended to repel pests. On cold, windy days, fat might be spread over the face as a protective layer, especially for those travelling or working outdoors. In certain traditions, fat was believed to have medicinal properties, helping soothe cracked heels, frostbite, or even certain rashes. The application might be followed by binding the area with a linen cloth, allowing the fat to absorb slowly. Among wealthier individuals, finer fats, such as goose fat or marrow, might be preferred, and these could be blended with imported perfumes or oils for a more pleasant application. However, even in noble households, the fundamental idea was the same. Fat was practical, accessible, and versatile. While elite grooming might involve rosewater rinses or almond oil, animal fat remained part of the broader repertoire, particularly in winter or when travelling far from amenities. For peasants, animal fat as a moisturizer was simply another extension of the no-waste mentality that governed daily life. It fit into a broader cycle of using every part of a slaughtered animal, from the hide and bones to the offal and fat. Texture and appearance of greased skin were accepted norms. No one expected a glossy, perfumed finish. The slightly tacky feel and faint animal scent were just part of existing in a world without synthetic skincare products or daily washing routines. In this way, the use of animal fat connected personal hygiene, resourcefulness, and survival. It kept skin functional in a hard environment, marked social and economic differences in subtle ways, and, like many other medieval grooming habits, left behind a sensory imprint that would be considered strange by modern standards, but entirely normal to those who lived it. By the later Middle Ages, scented powders had become a discreet but telling marker of status among the European elite. For those who could afford them, these fragrant concoctions were an important part of a daily routine aimed at managing the realities of life in an unwashed age. They did not clean the body in any meaningful way, but they softened the social impact of long periods without bathing, providing a cosmetic veil over the natural odours that accumulated in clothing, hair, and skin. Powders could be sprinkled on garments, dabbed into hair, or pressed into linen undergarments, releasing bursts of fragrance as the wearer moved. The ingredients varied according to wealth and access. In wealthy courts, powders might include ground orris root, crushed cloves, dried lavender, rose petals, cinnamon, and even costly imported musk or ambergris. These materials were expensive both because of their rarity and the labour involved in preparing them. Some were imported along established trade routes from the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Middle East, giving them an exotic cachet. Cheaper versions used by lower-ranking servants or modestly prosperous townsfolk might rely on local herbs such as rosemary, sage, or sweet woodruff, mixed with powdered chalk or rice flour to bulk out the volume. In an era before mass-produced soap or deodorant, these powders served a dual purpose. First, they lent a pleasant scent which could linger for hours, helping the wearer project refinement and social distinction. Second, their fine texture absorbed some of the natural oils that built up on hair and skin between washings. This was particularly useful for hair, which, if rarely washed, could become heavy and greasy. A dusting of fragrant powder could make it look and smell fresher, even if no actual cleaning had taken place. The fashion for perfumed powders was also closely tied to the textile habits of the time. Garments, especially those made of wool, held on to odours. Heavy cloaks and gowns could go months without washing, as laundering such items risked shrinking or damaging them. Powders helped freshen these fabrics without the need for full cleaning. Many wealthier individuals kept small drawstring pouches filled with the scented mixture tucked into their sleeves or belts, allowing them to sprinkle it discreetly as needed. Socially, the use of perfumed powders reinforced the visible and olfactory divide between classes. The wealthy could afford not only the ingredients but also the imported containers, often made of carved ivory, silver or gilded wood, used to store and carry them. The act of applying powder could even become a form of performance, part of the careful presentation of self in elite circles. Visitors to a noble's home might note the fragrance in the air as part of the cultivated atmosphere of refinement and control over one's environment. However, the use of scented powders was not without its critics. Some moralists and clerics warned that covering the smell of the body was an act of vanity, an attempt to deceive others about one's natural state. Others associated strong perfumes with moral laxity or seduction, especially in women. By the late medieval period, these powders also came under suspicion during outbreaks of plague, as some physicians believed that heavy fragrances could trap corrupted air close to the body. Still, their appeal persisted. In an age when most people carried the scent of their labour, their animals, and their meals on their skin and clothing, perfumed powders offered the wealthy a means of controlling how they were perceived. While they could not replace the effects of actual cleanliness, they signalled that one had the resources and leisure to invest in personal presentation, a small but potent marker of status in the sensory landscape of the medieval world. The preference for strong and spicy scents in medieval Europe was not just a matter of fashion, but a practical response to the constant challenge of overpowering body odour in a world with limited access to soap, fresh water and regular laundering. As noted in the previous section, the wealthy relied on perfumed powders to project refinement, but those powders often carried intense fragrances. Subtlety was rarely the goal. Fragrance needed to be robust enough to compete with the surrounding smells of unwashed bodies, heavy fabrics, animal byproducts and open fires. The choice of ingredients reflected this need for potency. Strong spices, such as cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg and pepper, were imported through long-distance trade and prized not only for their culinary uses, but for their aromatic power. They could mask a wide range of odours with their sharp, lingering presence. Musk, ambergris and civet, animal-derived scents that were pungent on their own, were also popular as their deep, earthy tones clung to fabrics and skin for extended periods. Resin-based scents like frankincense and myrrh brought a smoky richness that could persist even in damp or crowded indoor spaces. Such ingredients were expensive, which meant that the strength of one's personal fragrance often doubled as a signal of wealth. A person who smelled richly of cinnamon or musk was broadcasting both their ability to purchase such imports and the leisure to adorn themselves with them. In courtly settings, a strong scent could create an invisible presence, announcing someone's arrival before they were seen and lingering in a room after they had left. This was intentional. Fragrance became part of social performance, almost like a herald of status. Yet, these overpowering scents were not without side effects. In confined spaces, banquet halls, churches, or private chambers, the combination of multiple individuals wearing heavy perfumes could create a dense and sometimes overwhelming atmosphere. Modern accounts often describe this as cloying, but medieval noses were accustomed to intensity, whether from the pungent air of livestock or the acrid smoke of hearth fires. A sharply spiced fragrance may have been preferable to the sour or rancid smells it covered. Medical theory also played a role in scent selection. According to the humoral system of medicine, certain smells were thought to have health benefits, protecting the body from miasma or bad air that could cause illness. Spices and resins with their warming properties were believed to counteract the dangers of cold, damp environments. This belief further encouraged the liberal application of strong scents, especially during outbreaks of disease or in the colder months. In some cases, people carried small pomanders, metal or carved containers filled with perfumed materials, close to their noses to ensure they were constantly inhaling healthy air. For the wealthy, strong and spicy fragrances were both a personal indulgence and a defensive strategy against the sensory realities of the medieval world. They masked the inevitable build-up of odours from the body and clothing, asserted one's place in the social hierarchy, and, according to the medical thinking of the time, offered a measure of protection against sickness. While the subtler art of perfumery would develop centuries later, in the Middle Ages strength was a virtue in scent because anything less would have been simply drowned out by the environment. The use of herbs in clothing and bedding was a widespread practice in medieval Europe, serving both practical and symbolic purposes. As we saw in the previous section, strong and spicy perfumes were favoured by the wealthy for masking body odour and signalling status. But not everyone could afford imported resins, rare spices or musk-based fragrances. Herbs, by contrast, were more accessible, could be grown locally, and offered a cheaper way to introduce pleasant or medicinal scents into daily life. Lavender, rosemary and mint were among the most common choices, each with specific associations and practical uses. Lavender, with its sweet floral aroma, was believed to promote calm and deter pests such as fleas and moths. Rosemary had a sharper, resinous scent and was tied to ideas of purification and protection. Medieval herbalists claimed it could improve memory and ward off illness. Mint, whether peppermint or spearmint, brought a cooling, fresh aroma that could cut through stale indoor air. These herbs could be dried and placed inside linen sachets, sewn into the hems of garments, or sprinkled directly into bedding. The practice was not purely cosmetic. Lice, fleas and other vermin were a constant threat in a world where laundering was labour-intensive and regular bathing rare. Bedding, especially mattresses stuffed with straw or feathers, could harbour pests. Sprinkling herbs between layers, tucking sprigs inside pillowcases or hanging bunches from bed frames was a way to deter insects. Similarly, herb-stuffed pouches in clothing could help repel parasites that lived in the folds and seams of garments. The scent acted as a mild repellent while also masking the less pleasant odours that built up between washes. This integration of herbs into textiles also reflected medieval medical thinking. The humoral theory and miasma concept linked scent to health, believing that inhaling certain fragrances could balance the body's humours or protect against harmful air. Sleeping among rosemary sprigs or wearing lavender close to the skin was not simply about smelling nice, it was thought to strengthen the body's defences. In some cases, herbal mixtures were blended with powdered resins or ground spices to create more complex aromatic blends for the wealthy, who could afford to experiment with ingredient combinations. For commoners, herbs were a practical luxury. Even if fine perfumes were out of reach, lavender could be grown in a garden, rosemary in a pot near the door, and mint along the edges of fields. These could be harvested, dried, and stored for use through the year. For wealthier households, imported herbs or more exotic blends might be purchased through apothecaries, but the principle was the same: textiles and personal spaces were infused with scent as a way to make daily life more bearable. Over time, the association between certain herbs and personal freshness became embedded in social customs. Lavender-filled linen chests, rosemary and bridal wreaths, and mint-infused washwater for hands all carried connotations of cleanliness, refinement, and care. Even when people themselves were rarely washed, their garments and beds could carry the scent of something fresh and familiar. In a medieval world saturated with strong, unpleasant smells from the environment, these herbal notes offered not only a practical improvement, but a small psychological comfort, an aromatic claim to personal space in a crowded, odour-filled world. In medieval Europe, burning incense indoors was far more than a religious practice. While we often picture incense smoke curling through the air of a cathedral during Mass, the use of fragrant resins, woods, and herbs extended into domestic life, especially among the wealthy or those who could afford imported materials. As the previous section described, infusing living spaces with pleasant scents through herbs was a practical way to combat the smells of an unwashed world. Incense served a similar function, but with added symbolic and medicinal layers. Incense materials varied depending on status and location. The most luxurious blends used frankincense and myrrh from the Arabian Peninsula, benzoin from Southeast Asia, or sandalwood from India, goods brought to Europe through long-distance trade routes. These imports were costly, meaning their domestic use was a clear display of wealth. More modest households might burn local substitutes such as juniper berries, rosemary, pine resin, or dried herbs like sage and thyme. The principle was the same. Heat released fragrant smoke that could mask unpleasant odours and create an atmosphere of refinement. The belief in incense's power extended beyond its smell. According to the prevailing medical theories of the time, bad air, or miasma, was a cause of disease. Since incense produced a strong, clean scent, it was thought to help purify indoor spaces and protect against illness. This idea was not purely symbolic. Burning certain resins and herbs does release compounds with mild antimicrobial properties, which could reduce airborne bacteria or deter pests. In winter, when windows remained shut and people crowded indoors, incense smoke was seen as a kind of airborne shield. Its religious associations also lent incense a sense of moral and spiritual cleanliness. Even outside of formal worship, burning incense at home could be interpreted as an act of devotion, a way to keep one's household pure in both a physical and spiritual sense. Wealthy homes sometimes had dedicated incense burners, often made of metal and suspended by chains, that could be carried from room to room. In smaller houses, a simple clay or iron pot served the same function, sometimes placed beneath a table so the scent would rise among the people gathered there. Incense also played a role in hospitality. When important guests arrived, a host might burn fragrant materials to signal welcome and create a more pleasant environment. In some accounts, noble households burned incense during feasts to freshen the air between courses, counteracting the mix of smells from cooked meat, human bodies, and candle smoke. However, there were drawbacks. Incense was expensive to maintain as a daily habit, and the smoke could build up quickly in homes with poor ventilation. While some people found it pleasant, others considered heavy use oppressive, particularly when strong resins were burned in small rooms. Yet despite these limitations, incense remained a sought-after addition to domestic life, valued for its ability to transform an otherwise stale-smelling space into something fragrant, luxurious, and, at least in belief, healthier. In the medieval world, perfume was far more than a pleasant personal touch. It was a visible, or rather smellable, marker of social status. As the previous section on incense suggested, scent had both practical and symbolic value. But when it came to personal fragrance, the line between comfort and prestige was even sharper. While the poor relied on whatever herbs they could find or afford, the wealthy could access rare, imported ingredients that transformed scent into a form of social currency. Perfume in medieval Europe often took the form of scented oils, pomanders, or powdered sachets, each made with a blend of costly materials such as ambergris, musk, civet, and imported spices. Many of these ingredients travelled from as far as the Middle East, North Africa, or Asia, passing through the same trade routes that brought silk and precious metals. The expense of transport and the rarity of the raw materials meant that perfume was out of reach for most people, which made it an unmistakable signal of privilege. If you smelled of rose oil or musk, you weren't just masking odour, you were advertising your wealth. This association with wealth was reinforced by the way perfume was worn and displayed. Some nobles carried pomanders, small ornate containers filled with aromatic substances, hanging from belts or tucked into clothing. Others dabbed scented oils on hair, hands, or gloves. Even household linens could be perfumed, meaning that the wealthy could literally surround themselves with fragrance. Such practices were a kind of olfactory branding. You could tell someone's social standing without ever seeing their clothes. The use of perfume also tied into medieval ideals of refinement and civility. In aristocratic and courtly settings, smelling pleasant was considered part of presenting oneself as a cultured, civilized person. Chronicles and etiquette manuals from the period sometimes noted that those of high birth ought to avoid strong body odour, not necessarily for hygiene's sake, but because it betrayed a lack of elegance. Scent in this way became an unspoken language, one that communicated education, breeding, and access to luxury goods. Religious and medical beliefs added another layer of meaning. According to humoral theory, certain pleasant scents were considered beneficial for health, lifting the spirits and protecting against disease. The wealthy could therefore justify their use of perfume as not just vanity, but a health measure. At the same time, perfumes could also function as a form of soft power. When attending public events or receiving guests, a noble who carried a distinctive fragrance might leave a lasting impression, just as a fine cloak or jewelled ring would. However, this exclusivity also drew criticism. Some moralists and preachers condemned the use of extravagant perfumes as a sign of vanity or moral corruption, especially among women. They argued that masking one's natural scent was deceitful, or that such luxuries encouraged pride and lust. Despite these objections, the practice persisted because perfume was not only desirable, it was a public statement of one's position in the social hierarchy. In short, perfume in medieval Europe was never just about smelling nice. It was about what that scent said about you, that you had money to spare, access to far-off trade goods, and the means to distinguish yourself from the masses. The poor might wash in rosemary water on a festival day, but the rich could wear the perfume of kings. By the late Middle Ages, many educated Europeans believed that the link between smell and disease was not just symbolic, it was causal. As noted in the previous section, the wealthy often scented themselves and their surroundings as a way to signal refinement, but their motivations were not purely social. Under the prevailing medical framework of the time, strong odours, especially foul ones, were thought to directly cause illness. This idea, known as the miasma theory, dominated medical thinking for centuries before germ theory replaced it in the 19th century. The miasma theory held that disease arose from bad air contaminated with decaying matter, waste, or other sources of rot. Such air was thought to carry invisible particles that could corrupt the body's humours and make a person sick. The smell itself was treated as both symptom and source. If something reeked, it was assumed to be dangerous to inhale. Physicians and public authorities did not yet understand bacteria or viruses, but they knew that outbreaks of plague, dysentery, or fevers often coincided with foul-smelling environments, slaughterhouses, open drains, refuse heaps, and stagnant water. To them, the correlation seemed obvious. This belief shaped urban planning, public health measures, and even personal habits. Medieval cities sometimes issued ordinances to remove waste, clean streets, or relocate butchers' stalls, not because people understood pathogens, but because they wanted to disperse bad air. During outbreaks, households might burn herbs, carry pomanders filled with fragrant materials, or splash vinegar on floors and walls in the belief that pleasant or sharp smells could counteract miasma. Even clothing could be perfumed or infused with aromatic oils as a kind of portable protection. The wealthy with more resources could go further, installing perfumed fountains in gardens, keeping bundles of lavender in living quarters, or employing servants to burn resinous woods indoors. While this overlapped with the status-driven fragrance culture described earlier, it also reflected a genuine health concern. Doctors of the time often recommended surrounding oneself with sweet air to maintain vitality and avoid illness, especially during summer heat or when travelling through crowded, foul-smelling quarters of a city. In rural areas, the miasma theory influenced how people approached marshes, stagnant ponds, or even freshly turned soil. Farmers might avoid certain tasks at dusk when mist was thought to rise and carry disease. Villagers could be reluctant to settle too close to swamps or open cesspits, not just for comfort, but for fear of the corrupt vapours they believed emanated from such places. Religious processions and civic rituals sometimes incorporated scented elements for both symbolic and practical reasons. Incense in churches, for example, was meant to honour God, but was also thought to purify the air. Similarly, during plague outbreaks, processions might involve the burning of aromatic plants along the route. These measures reflected a worldview where the sensory experience of smell was inseparable from health. While the miasma theory was flawed, it was not entirely without merit from a medieval perspective. Avoiding foul-smelling, unsanitary areas could sometimes reduce exposure to dangerous conditions, even if the mechanism was misunderstood. Rotten food, human waste and animal carcasses could indeed spread disease, but not because the smell itself was toxic. In the absence of microbiology, odour served as a crude but sometimes useful warning system. By the end of the medieval period, the link between smell and health was deeply entrenched in both elite and popular culture. This meant that the same perfumed pomander a noblewoman carried as a fashion statement also represented in her mind a shield against sickness. And as we'll see in the next section, such beliefs didn't just shape personal behaviour, they influenced how entire communities responded to epidemics and how they organised the spaces in which they lived and worked. In the context of the miasma theory and the medieval belief that foul air could make people sick, the ability to detect spoiled food by smell was more than just a matter of taste. It was considered an essential safeguard. Long before refrigeration, expiry dates, or laboratory testing, the human nose was one of the most reliable tools for assessing whether something was safe to eat. People in the Middle Ages relied heavily on their sense of smell to judge meat, fish, dairy, and even stored grains, and the practice was woven into both household routines and market life. Freshness in medieval terms was relative. A cut of meat or a barrel of fish might not be considered spoiled until the odour was unmistakable, sharp, sour, or putrid. Without refrigeration, these changes happened quickly, especially in summer, so people became adept at recognising the earliest signs of decay. Experienced cooks, butchers and fishmongers developed a vocabulary for describing these smells, distinguishing between meat that was ageing but still usable and meat that had crossed into dangerous territory. For example, mutton with a strong odour might be boiled with vinegar and herbs to mask the smell and make it palatable, but if the scent suggested deep rot, it was more likely to be discarded or fed to animals. Markets were places where this skill was put to constant use. Buyers often leaned in close to sniff fish or cuts of meat before agreeing on a price. A whiff of sourness in a wheel of cheese or an ammonia-like scent from fish could lower the asking price or halt a sale altogether. This sniff test wasn't foolproof. Spices and marinades could disguise some odours, but it served as the first line of defence for many households. Sellers were equally aware of the role smell played and would sometimes take steps to mask or neutralise bad odours with strong seasonings, smoke or aromatic leaves. Grain and bread, too, could give off telltale scents when they were no longer fit to eat. Damp grain that began to smell musty was a warning sign of mould, which could make people sick. Bakers and brewers who relied on large quantities of grain were particularly alert to this, as spoiled grain could ruin entire batches of bread or ale. Smell, in this case, helped prevent costly mistakes as well as illness. In wealthier households, the role of the nose in food safety was complemented by servants whose job it was to inspect provisions. A cook might reject a delivery of fish based on smell alone, knowing that even if it looked acceptable, the odour revealed its true age. In poorer households, where waste was harder to afford, people were more likely to try to salvage food with strong-smelling additions, garlic, onions, mustard, or heavy spices, to cover the scent of decline. The practice extended beyond the kitchen. Sailors, soldiers and travellers learned to rely on smell to judge preserved foods during long journeys. Salted meat or fish that gave off a rancid odour might be scraped, rinsed or resalted to make it edible. In some cases, the smell was ignored out of necessity. During famine or siege, people ate food they would otherwise reject. But in normal circumstances, a bad smell was a clear and immediate warning. This dependence on smell meant that people developed sharper awareness of changes in odour than many modern eaters. Today, with refrigeration and packaging, most people encounter far fewer truly spoiled items, and the warning stage is often reached long before food becomes hazardous. In medieval Europe, however, the boundary between fresh and dangerous could be only a matter of hours in summer heat, making the nose an indispensable survival tool. By the later Middle Ages, this everyday vigilance was reinforced by the belief, tied to miasma theory, that foul-smelling food was not just unpalatable, but actively harmful. Inhaling the vapours of rot was thought to weaken the body, making it more susceptible to disease. This meant that recognising and avoiding bad smells wasn't just about preventing food poisoning. It was part of a broader strategy to protect health. And as we'll see in the next section, these concerns over smell and safety didn't stop with what people ate. They extended to the very air they breathed in the spaces where food was stored, cooked and sold. In medieval Europe, the smell of sweat was not automatically considered unpleasant or shameful. It could be a sign of diligence, endurance and honest labour. In an age when most people worked physically demanding jobs outdoors or in workshops, perspiration was simply part of daily life. It was the byproduct of effort, and for many it carried a kind of unspoken respectability. A man returning from the fields with a soaked tunic and damp hair was visibly marked as someone who had contributed to the household's survival. Similarly, a woman who had been at the wash bench kneading dough near a hot hearth or bending over rows of vegetables in the sun carried the smell of her work on her body and clothing. This was especially true in rural peasant communities, where almost all productive tasks were physically taxing. Ploughing, planting, reaping, hauling water, cutting wood. These activities produced sweat year-round. Without modern deodorants, antiperspirants, or frequent changes of clothing, the odour of labour lingered on the skin and in the fabric. It was simply part of a shared sensory world. One villager's scent after a day in the hayfield was not drastically different from another's after tending sheep or digging ditches. There was no expectation that people would or could smell fresh by modern standards at the end of a workday. The association between sweat and productivity was also reinforced in the social hierarchy. Among peasants, it was understood that those who sweated earned their keep. In contrast, the nobility and wealthy merchant classes valued paleness, soft hands and clean garments as signs that they did not need to toil. Their lack of sweat was a visible and olfactory marker of privilege, yet even in elite circles, certain contexts excused sweat. Knights in training, soldiers in battle or craftsmen at their benches could be admired for the physical effort required in their roles, even if the resulting smell was strong. Guild workshops in towns also carried the scent of labour. Tanners, smiths, brewers and bakers all worked in hot enclosed spaces where the smell of sweat mingled with other industry-specific odours: animal hides, hot iron, fermenting mash or fresh bread. For apprentices and masters alike, these smells were inseparable from the identity of their trade. A blacksmith's muscled arms and sweat-dampened shirt were as much proof of his skill as the finished horseshoe he held. In some cases, sweat was even believed to have certain virtues. Medieval medical theory, based partly on ancient Greek ideas, suggested that sweating helped purge the body of excess humours and harmful substances. Hard work that produced perspiration could thus be framed as beneficial for health. The smell that accompanied it was an accepted side effect, one that was less offensive when understood as the natural outcome of a necessary bodily function. Of course, the line between acceptable and unpleasant could shift depending on setting. Sweat in the field or workshop was one thing. Excessive odour in a crowded church, at a feast, or in the Lord's Hall might draw quiet disapproval. In such moments, people might freshen themselves by rinsing face and hands, changing an outer layer, or applying scented herbs. But the complete removal of sweat smell was rarely possible without a full wash. which was infrequent for most. This tolerance for sweat-related odours was shaped by the realities of medieval life: constant physical labour, limited water for washing, and clothes that absorbed and held scent over many days. For the majority, it was impossible to live without it. Where modern culture often seeks to mask or eliminate sweat smell entirely, medieval society largely accepted it as proof of a day's honest work, an unavoidable, even honourable part of being alive and contributing to the community. And just as the labouring body left its mark through scent, so too did the environment, as the places people worked often carried smells that clung to them long after they had gone home. In medieval communities, smell was not only tolerated, it could serve as a form of personal identification. In a world where artificial fragrances were rare and hygiene practices limited, each individual carried a distinctive scent shaped by their work, diet, living environment, and clothing. People became accustomed to these unique combinations and in many cases could recognise someone's presence without seeing them. This was especially true in small villages where everyone knew one another and daily life brought frequent close contact. For example, a shepherd might carry the faint musk of sheep's wool mixed with the grassy, earthy notes of the pastures where he spent his days. A blacksmith's scent would bear the traces of smoke, hot metal, and sweat from the forge. A brewer or alewife might have the lingering tang of hops and fermenting grain. Even without names being spoken, such associations allowed people to connect smell with identity, an unspoken but reliable part of community awareness. Clothing played a significant role in this olfactory recognition. Since garments were worn repeatedly without frequent washing, they absorbed the smells of both the body and the environment. A fisherman's tunic would take on the briny air of the docks and the scent of his catches, just as a baker's apron would retain the aroma of flour, yeast, and the warm oven. These odours were not necessarily viewed as offensive, rather they were familiar and often reassuring. In an age before photographs or even widespread literacy, the senses, sight, sound and smell, were crucial to knowing who was who. Homes, too, contributed to personal scent profiles. A person living in a smoke-filled cottage with a central hearth would carry that smoky residue into the street, while someone in a bustling urban district might bear traces of tanneries, markets or nearby stables. Bedding, rarely laundered and often stuffed with straw or wool, absorbed human scent over time, further personalising it. In close quarters, families became attuned to these subtle differences, making smell part of how they knew each other. This ability to recognise individuals by scent also extended to the social and occupational hierarchy. Nobility, who often wore fine fabrics perfumed with herbs or oils, could be identified by the fragrant traces of their luxury. Lavender sachets sewn into clothing, rosemary sprigs tucked in sleeves, or the faint scent of imported resins from incense. In contrast, the working poor were more likely to be known by the unfiltered scents of their trade and living conditions. This distinction could be both a source of pride and a marker of status, reinforcing the social boundaries of the time. The concept of odour as identity was not without practical uses. In crowded spaces like markets, taverns or church gatherings, a whiff of a familiar scent could guide someone through the throng toward a friend or family member. Likewise, in darkened interiors, lit only by candlelight or fire, smell could signal who had entered a room long before their face became visible. In an era when sensory cues were vital, scent served as an unspoken language that carried meaning without a word being exchanged. Thus, in medieval life, odour was more than a byproduct of limited bathing or manual labour. It was an intimate, everyday part of recognition, community bonds, and even social identity. Far from being uniformly unwelcome, it was often a sign of familiarity, proof of who someone was, where they had been, and the life they lived. In this way, the smells that clung to people were not merely tolerated. They were woven into the very fabric of medieval human connection. By the end of the medieval period and into the early modern era, significant changes began to reshape hygiene practices across Europe. These shifts were driven by a combination of technological advancement, evolving medical theories, urban planning reforms, and changes in cultural attitudes toward cleanliness. While the Middle Ages had relied on limited bathing, rudimentary waste disposal, and minimal soap use, The centuries that followed introduced innovations that would gradually redefine public health and personal hygiene. One of the most transformative developments was the spread of plumbing systems. In medieval towns, water had to be fetched from rivers, wells, or public fountains, and waste was disposed of in pits, open ditches, or the streets themselves. By the 16th and 17th centuries, wealthier households and some urban centres began installing rudimentary pipe networks, channeling fresh water directly to homes or public pumps. Aqueduct-style systems were revived in certain cities, bringing cleaner water from distant sources, and early drainage systems started to redirect wastewater away from living areas. Though far from modern standards, these steps marked a clear break from the stagnant waste and water contamination that had plagued medieval streets. Soap production also expanded and improved during this period. Medieval soap existed, but it was often coarse, made from animal fat and wood ash, and used sparingly due to cost and availability. Post-medieval manufacturing refined the process, especially in regions like Castile in Spain and Marseille in France, where olive oil-based soaps became widely known for their gentler properties and pleasant scents. These products not only encouraged more frequent washing, but also began to associate cleanliness with social refinement. By the 18th century, scented and moulded soaps had become popular luxury goods, and public awareness of their benefits was spreading beyond the wealthy elite. Urban sanitation laws emerged as another turning point. The late medieval belief in miasma, the idea that bad smells spread disease, continued into the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras, but it now inspired more organised civic measures. Municipal authorities passed regulations to control waste dumping, manage animal slaughter within city limits, and maintain cleaner markets. Street cleaning services, although rudimentary, were introduced in some cities. Open sewers began to be covered or redirected, reducing direct exposure to waste and foul odours. Over time, these public health efforts helped reshape city living conditions, even if rural areas lagged behind. Public bathhouses, which had declined in the later Middle Ages due to fears of disease and moral suspicion, saw a partial revival in some regions, though they increasingly catered to the wealthy. Private bathing rooms became more common among the upper classes, with copper or tin-lined tubs and portable heating systems for warm water. These developments, combined with improved soap and water access, meant that those with resources could maintain a level of personal hygiene unimaginable to most medieval peasants. Importantly, these changes didn't happen overnight. Many rural communities maintained older hygiene habits well into the modern era, and even in cities, early plumbing and sanitation were far from universal. But over the centuries, the combination of infrastructure, consumer goods, and legal measures created a foundation for the dramatic improvements in cleanliness that would characterize the 19th and 20th centuries. In effect, post-medieval hygiene improvements marked a gradual but decisive shift away from the smell-saturated, waste-laden environments of the medieval world. With better water delivery, more accessible soap, and the beginnings of organised sanitation, people's expectations of cleanliness evolved, setting the stage for the fully modern hygiene standards we recognise today. By the early modern period, the growing infrastructure, improved soap production, and organised sanitation efforts were not only transforming hygiene practices, they were also shifting cultural attitudes toward what it meant to be clean. In the medieval world, cleanliness was often a matter of practicality, religious ritual, or health superstition, rather than a deeply ingrained social virtue. But as urban living expanded, trade networks grew, and public health reforms took hold, cleanliness began to emerge as a marker of status, morality, and even personal character. This transformation had multiple drivers. One was the influence of the rising middle class, particularly in towns and cities. As merchants, artisans, and professionals gained wealth and influence, they adopted habits and appearances that set them apart from the rural poor. Clean, well-maintained clothing, washed hands, and groomed hair became visible signals of respectability. These habits were easier to maintain with better access to soap, water, and laundering services, but they also carried a new cultural weight. Being clean meant being disciplined, prosperous, and trustworthy. Another factor was the evolving connection between cleanliness and health. The miasma theory, which linked foul odours to disease, continued to dominate medical thinking into the 18th and 19th centuries. Even without a modern understanding of germs, people increasingly associated fresh-smelling homes and well-washed bodies with safety from illness. Public health campaigns, especially in growing industrial cities, began to promote regular cleaning as a civic duty. Schools, military institutions and workplaces reinforced these ideas, expecting individuals to meet certain hygiene standards, not just for themselves but for the perceived good of the community. Religious and moral teachings also adapted. In earlier centuries, asceticism sometimes favoured a disregard for bodily care, framing indulgence in frequent bathing as vanity. Over time, however, many preachers and writers began to present cleanliness as a reflection of inner virtue. Sermons and moral guides praised orderly dress and personal grooming as signs of a disciplined soul. In Protestant Europe especially, the cleanliness is next to godliness ethos gained traction, merging moral respectability with physical upkeep. Print culture played its part as well. With the spread of newspapers, pamphlets and books, advice on personal care became more widely available. Manuals on household management often devoted sections to hygiene routines, laundering techniques, and ways to keep living spaces sweet and odour-free. These instructions framed cleanliness not as an occasional effort, but as a regular practice that defined a well-run household. By the 19th century, the cultural value of cleanliness had become deeply embedded in everyday life, especially among urban populations. Bathing shifted from a sporadic activity to a regular expectation. Clothing was laundered more often, and public opinion increasingly judged unkempt or unwashed individuals as lazy, unhealthy, or morally suspect. This change did not erase poverty-driven challenges. Many working-class families still struggled to maintain these new standards, but it created a powerful social pressure that shaped behaviour across economic lines. In short, the post-medieval era saw cleanliness evolve from a sporadic, situational concern into a cultural expectation. It became a sign of belonging, a way to demonstrate moral standing, and a measure of one's integration into the modernising world. This shift laid the groundwork for the hygiene norms we take for granted today, norms that would have been unrecognisable to most medieval Europeans. As hygiene norms evolved in the post-medieval period, public memory began to reshape how the past was perceived. By the 18th and 19th centuries, a growing fascination with medieval castles, rural villages, and simpler times emerged in art, literature, and popular culture. Yet this romantic vision left out many of the sensory realities, especially smell, that had defined daily life for centuries. The modern retelling of the past tended to smooth away the harsher truths, replacing them with idealised imagery of clean air, fragrant gardens, and neatly dressed villages. Part of this erasure was deliberate. Writers and painters catering to the tastes of a wealthier, more urban audience rarely wanted to remind patrons that their ancestors had lived among open sewers, barnyard animals, and the unwashed masses. Instead, they painted pastoral scenes of green meadows and fresh breezes, with no hint of the pungent odours that would have permeated those same landscapes. Popular historical novels and stage plays leaned towards sanitised depictions, where the air was scented with roses rather than manure, and medieval banquets smelled only of spiced wine, not the less appealing odours of hundreds of unwashed bodies in a cramped hall. Another reason for this selective memory was the very progress of hygiene itself. By the 19th century, modern plumbing, regular bathing and large-scale sanitation projects had created an entirely different baseline for cleanliness. As people grew accustomed to fresher-smelling cities and cleaner homes, it became harder to imagine, let alone accurately recall, what pre-industrial streets or living quarters actually smelled like. The sensory gap made it easier to accept a cleaned-up version of history, where the grime and stench were treated as exaggerated myths or quaint details rather than everyday realities. The romanticisation also intersected with nationalism and heritage building. Countries looking to construct proud historical narratives often highlighted the architectural, military, or artistic achievements of their medieval ancestors, while quietly ignoring the less glamorous aspects of their daily existence. Tourists visiting restored castles in the Victorian era were guided through polished halls, not shown the latrine shafts or midden pits that would have been unavoidable in their original state. The absence of these elements in public history reinforced the illusion of a fragrant, dignified past. Even academic histories of the 19th and early 20th centuries sometimes downplayed smell. Scholars focused on political events, religious movements, and great works of art, while the intimate details of bodily odour, spoiled food, and waste disposal were treated as peripheral, if mentioned at all. It was not until the later 20th century, with the rise of social history and sensory studies, that historians began to reconstruct the smellscape of earlier eras and acknowledge how central odour was to the medieval experience. This modern tendency to forget or gloss over the smells of the past means that many people today imagine medieval life through a lens of visual beauty and nostalgic charm, disconnected from the reality that these same settings were often accompanied by overwhelming and inescapable odours. The result is a version of history that is comfortable to consume but incomplete, a story stripped of the very sensations that would have shaped how people understood and navigated their world. By recognising how and why these smells were erased from memory, we gain not only a more accurate picture of the past, but also a better understanding of how cultural values filter what we choose to remember. By the time we reach the modern age, the sensory world of daily life has been transformed almost beyond recognition. Where medieval streets were defined by the mingling odours of waste, unwashed bodies, livestock and cooking fires, contemporary towns and cities now more often carry the faint sweetness of detergents, floral-scented cleaning sprays, and yes, even scented candles burning in shop windows. This shift from stench to curated fragrance is not simply the result of technology, but of a profound cultural redefinition of what clean and pleasant mean. The 19th century's sanitation revolution, driven by public health campaigns, urban sewage systems and piped water, laid the foundation for a new baseline of hygiene. Soap production became industrialised, making it both more affordable and more widely available. Bathing, which had once been infrequent and seasonal, began to be promoted as a daily or weekly necessity. This was reinforced by the rise of advertising, which not only sold products but also created the expectation that the absence of odour was a sign of health, morality and refinement. The earlier medieval tolerance for natural bodily smells was replaced by the idea that such scents were undesirable and socially damaging. As plumbing and sanitation advanced, so did control over the air indoors. In the medieval world, there was little to do about smells in the home except open a window or burn herbs. By contrast, the 20th century saw the spread of chemical air fresheners, perfumed soaps, and candles made not for light but for fragrance. These products didn't just mask odours, they were marketed as lifestyle enhancers, with scents tied to emotions, seasons, or even social aspirations. A cinnamon candle could suggest coziness and hospitality, a citrus spray, energy and freshness. Smell became something not only to neutralise but to curate and sell. This transformation also reveals how far human perception of normal odour has shifted. In medieval times, the combination of animal smells, human sweat, and cooking fires was an unremarkable background to life. Today, such a mixture would be considered overwhelming or even intolerable. This change is partly physiological. Our noses have not evolved, but our expectations have. Living in cleaner environments means we are more likely to notice and react strongly to scents that our ancestors barely registered. The irony is that the modern obsession with pleasant scents has not entirely eliminated bad smells. It has simply created new ways to manage and reframe them. Where medieval people might have thrown rosemary into the rushes on their floors, we place reed diffusers in our living rooms. Where they might have burned frankincense to mask a foul chamber, we now light a candle labelled Mediterranean Sea Breeze. The goal remains the same, to assert some control over an ever-present human truth, that our lives, our work, and our bodies produce odours, but the means have become far more sophisticated. Looking at the journey from the open sewers of medieval cities to the neatly packaged jar candles of the present underscores just how much of history has been shaped not only by sight and sound, but by smell. It also suggests that while we may pride ourselves on our freshness, future generations could look back on our perfumed age with its own kind of bemused nostalgia, wondering what we were trying to hide, or what sense defined our world. In that sense, the story of smell is not just about progress, but about changing tastes, cultural priorities, and the ongoing human desire to make our environments more pleasant than the realities of life would naturally allow. And so, as the last traces of medieval stench fade from our story, it becomes clear that the journey from those earthy, pungent streets to our world of scented candles and minty toothpaste has been long, winding, and deeply human. For centuries, smell was not merely a background detail of life, it was life. The odour of the marketplace, the barn, the bathhouse, the hearth, and the body itself formed an invisible map of existence, guiding people through familiarity and warning them of danger. What was once ordinary is now almost unimaginable. We have traced how beliefs, technology, and shifting values reshaped the human relationship with smell. The medieval world, with its fear of water, its seasonal bathing, its layers of wool and linen absorbing months of sweat, and its narrow streets filled with both people and livestock, was a place where odour was as constant as weather. It was not a failure of cleanliness as we understand it today. It was the natural result of the world they inhabited and the tools they had to live within it. From folk remedies for bad breath to perfumed powders meant to disguise unwashed hair, people worked with what they knew, often with ingenuity born from necessity. Over the centuries, as science and sanitation changed what was possible, our standards shifted. Plumbing and soap became commonplace, advertising turned freshness into a virtue, and the absence of odour became a marker of respectability. Smell moved from being a tolerated fact of life to something managed, controlled, and even commodified. Our modern age offers 1,000 ways to alter the air around us, diffusers, sprays, oils and candles, transforming our environments into curated sensory spaces, far removed from the raw immediacy of the past. And yet in this transformation, something subtle has been lost. Medieval people might have found our world strangely scentless, our air too sterile, our noses too quick to wrinkle. Their familiarity with the smell of hard work, of cooking fires, of animals and seasons tied them more closely to the physical reality of life. While we enjoy a cleaner, more comfortable existence, we also live in a carefully filtered atmosphere, one that may leave future historians wondering what the real scent of our time was. As you settle in and let these thoughts drift, imagine the quiet of a medieval night after the market has closed, the air cooling, the fires banked. The smells are still there. Wood smoke, drying herbs, the faint tang of animals asleep in their pens, but they are softened now, muted in the darkness. People breathe them in without thought, as familiar as the moon above the rooftops. In that world, scent is not an intruder or an accessory. It is part of the landscape, woven into every breath. And with that, the story rests. We have walked from a time when odour was the ever-present companion of life, through centuries of change, to a moment where we can light a candle and choose the fragrance we wish to breathe. The world is quieter now and cleaner, but history lingers in the air if you know how to catch it. Let it fade slowly, like the last wisp of incense in a long cooled room, and drift as the past grows still. Good night.